What if humanity isn't the first version of itself? If every rise hides an older one beneath it, buried, broken, or erased by time? And what if the ruins we've already found are only the surface of what came before? Welcome to the 101 Archive. Tonight, we'll travel through 101 mysteries of lost civilizations, places that built the impossible, vanished without warning, and left behind questions our science still can't silence. We'll pass from temples older than history to cities planned with impossible precision, from empires swallowed by deserts and seas to forgotten cultures that seem to know too much too early. Every ruin is a clue, every silence a message that somehow survived us. Take a slow breath. Let's begin where history ends and memory begins, among the oldest stones humanity ever raised, in the dust of Göbekli Tepe. You don't need to close your eyes to imagine it. Just stand before a low hill in southeastern Anatolia and watch how the earth itself, shaped by human hands for millennia, hides something that doesn't fit within the usual story of the Neolithic. As you peel away layers of dust, what emerges is not a humble village nor a hunting camp, but monumental rings of stone, T-shaped pillars reaching 6 meters high, carved with animals that still seem to move beneath the oblique light. Here you notice the first major fact that reorders history. Radiocarbon dates and stratigraphy place Göbekli Tepe around 9500 BCE, thousands of years before complex farming communities were thought to build temples. Archaeologists classify it within the pre-pottery Neolithic, a period when textbooks still describe small bands of hunter-gatherers without architecture or hierarchy. And yet these circular enclosures with stone benches and sculpted pillars insist on the opposite. The timeline bends, and you begin to see why this first discovery has forced historians to redraw the path from hunting, farming, temples, into something far less linear. If that were the whole story, it would already be astonishing, but the second layer complicates everything further. The pillars' surfaces reveal intricate reliefs: foxes, boars, cranes, felines, and snakes. Their outlines still sharp, abstract symbols repeating in measured rhythm. The tools were all stone, no copper, no bronze, and still the symmetry of the T-shapes, the precision of the joints, the geometry of the rings, speak of an understanding of material and form, far beyond primitive. Experts remind us there was no metallurgy at play. The limestone and basalt were shaped with hammerstones and abrasives, the multi-ton blocks quarried nearby and transported through a system requiring foresight, cooperation and engineering discipline. As you trace the carved line of a fox biting the pillar's edge, the conclusion becomes inescapable. This was not improvisation, but program, and that program unfolded at a time we once imagined incapable of planning anything so grand. If monumental architecture predates agriculture, what compelled its creation? That question opens the third thread, one that divides archaeologists and invites reflection. Some propose that Göbekli Tepe hints at social structures more complex than typical hunter-gatherer bands, perhaps ritual leadership, regional networks, and seasonal gatherings mobilized for ceremonial labor. Others go further, suggesting that the sequence itself may invert, that it wasn't agriculture enabling temples, but the need for ritual gathering that fostered agriculture. In this reading, religious coordination became the seed of settled life, yet even within debate, caution persists. There is no evidence of permanent urbanism, bureaucracy, or written administration here, only ritual monumentalism preceding farming. The site doesn't imply a lost advanced civilization in the romantic sense, but rather an unexpectedly sophisticated ritual community. That distinction matters. It keeps us grounded in evidence instead of myth. The fourth fact deepens the mystery by shifting focus from building to burial. Göbekli Tepe was not abandoned to weather and time. Its creators deliberately buried it. Entire enclosures were filled with rubble and soil, as if the community intended to seal away their own past. This intentional burial suggests a ritual of closure, perhaps cyclical renewal. Each time one ring was covered, another was raised above it, layering history like sediment of belief. In doing so, they created not only a sanctuary, but a man-made hill, a monument of time itself. The act of preservation, through concealment, transforms the site from simple ruin to cosmic clock, a place where memory was designed to sleep beneath its successors. Now, as you connect these four layers, the full logic emerges. The site's extraordinary age challenges every assumption about when organized society began. Its precision with stone tools forces a redefinition of technology, expanding it beyond materials to include coordination, design, and collective knowledge. The ritual hypothesis reframes complexity as something cultural, not imperial, and the cycles of burial show that for these early builders, memory was not meant to be displayed, it was meant to be renewed. Each generation covered the old to build the new, turning the landscape into a palimpsest of devotion. It's tempting, almost irresistibly so, to fill the gaps with romance, to imagine vanished sciences, forgotten gods, secret knowledge. But the evidence draws you back to solid ground. There is no metal, no writing, no centralized economy. There are instead carved stones organized with mathematical awareness, crafted by communities capable of planning and repetition. The animal reliefs, snakes, cranes, foxes, may symbolize clans, myths, constellations, or seasons, but none of those interpretations are certain. What is certain is that the site transforms what we thought we knew about human beginnings. Once scholars assumed that faith followed farming, here it may have preceded it. Monumentality, it seems, was not born from abundance, but from belief. And beneath all these questions lies the human effort itself. To move stones weighing several tons required more than strength. It required knowledge of terrain, scheduling, food supply, leadership. The architecture presupposes cooperation across families or tribes, and a social rhythm that could assemble and disperse workers in seasonal cycles. The burial of each enclosure might have served both symbolic and practical ends, closing a chapter of collective labor, marking transition, and perhaps renewing social bonds. Through that lens, the site becomes not just sacred space, but social engine, a calendar around which people gathered to remember, rebuild, and belong. What makes Göbekli Tepe so unsettling, even now, is not only its age or its grandeur, but its reversal of logic. It forces us to ask whether civilization truly followed the path we once believed. If temples came before villages, then faith, not farming, may have been the catalyst for permanence. The implication ripples outward. Perhaps the human drive to create meaning, not just to survive, was civilization's first blueprint. As the light fades over the Anatolian plain, the hill glows with quiet persistence. The pillars still stand in their circles, foxes and cranes still guarding their eternal dusk, and you're left with a question that no excavation can fully answer. When the first cities later rose along the rivers of Mesopotamia, when clay tablets bore the earliest words, were they remembering something of these circles of stone? The line between memory and invention blurs here, at the dawn of architecture. Whatever Göbekli Tepe was, it proves that the first monument humanity ever built was not to power, but to connection. You follow the path that descends from the stone hill and opens onto a wide alluvial plain. Here the question of when words began to take shape finds a concrete answer. It happened the moment clay met fire and memory became durable. This is the first firm fact of this chapter, accepted by every specialist. In Sumer, toward the end of the 4th millennium BCE, writing emerged, cuneiform, born from accounting tokens and administrative tallies that evolved into signs pressed onto tablets. It did not appear for poetry or philosophy, but for grain, labor, taxes, and gods of the temple. The earliest marks were pictograms, later stylized into wedge-shaped impressions made with a reed stylus. As these signs were standardized in the city of Uruk, scribes could read each other's records. The implication is clear. The first documented complexity of humankind was bureaucratic. Around those clay tablets rose temples, workshops, and canals, visible expressions of a society already divided by labor, hierarchy, and ritual calendars. If history were linear, this might seem like a simple sequence. First they wrote, then they told stories. But the second layer of this civilization introduces tension. The Sumerian king list, compiled and recopied over centuries, names dynasties stretching back to a time before the flood, granting the earliest rulers reigns that spanned thousands, even tens of thousands of years. No scholar reads it as literal chronology. It is a theological and political artifact, legitimizing authority by linking every king to divine sanction and cosmic order. Its famous line, "Then kingship descended from heaven," is less history than declaration of worldview. Philologists comparing versions note how reign lengths were expanded or shortened to serve ideology, emphasizing one city's dominance over another. What matters is not whether anyone ruled for 800 years, but that Sumer created two distinct modes of truth, one that measured barley by the bushel and another that measured time by myth. The coexistence of both, the practical tablet and the cosmic tablet, is the signature of a culture that wrote to administer and to remember simultaneously. Looking toward the horizon of sun-dried brick, you meet the third axis of this civilization's identity, the ziggurats. Stepped platforms linked to temples, they rose as stairways between heaven and earth. Their orientations were never random. Archaeological surveys reveal consistent alignments with the cardinal points, evidence of systematic observation of the sky. Cities like Eridu, and Uruk were built as reflections of cosmic geometry. Each temple corresponded to celestial order. The moon god Nanasin ruled over the sun god Utu Shamash over justice and day, and Inanna Venus over love and war. The ziggurat thus embodied a synthesis of religion, architecture, and astronomy. You don't need to imagine them as modern observatories to see their function. They were cosmic regulators, anchoring human ritual to the rhythm of the heavens. Through them, the city became both calendar and cosmos, its streets aligned with stars, its ceremonies timed to the movement of light. Combine these three layers, writing, royal myth, celestial architecture, and you still sense a missing dimension, the question of where humans themselves fit within this ordered universe. The fourth element provides that answer. Later Mesopotamian creation epics, written in Akkadian but rooted in Sumerian ideas, describe humanity's divine manufacture from clay mixed with the blood or breath of a god. The lesser deities, weary of labor, demanded relief. Thus humans were formed to bear their burden and serve through ritual and work. The Enuma Elish would codify this theology in Babylon, but its motifs already existed in Sumerian hymns like Enki and Ninmah and Enki and Ninhursag. The human being, moulded from the earth and infused with divine essence, became both servant and participant in cosmic order. The result is a worldview where the temple, city, and ziggurat mirror heaven itself, each a model of divine organization on earth. In this way, Sumerian accounting and theology do not contradict each other. They operate as parallel systems of order, one for the gods, one for grain. But deserts reclaim what rivers build. The fifth fact in this chain reminds you that no civilization, however sophisticated, escapes environment. Toward the end of the 3rd millennium BCE, the Sumerian world entered decline. Paleoclimate records mark the 4.2 kilo-year event, a prolonged drought that reduced rainfall, raised soil salinity, and strained irrigation systems. Political unity fractured. City-states, once balanced in rivalry, turned upon each other, while outside pressures mounted from Elamites and Amorites. Around 2004 BCE, the 3rd dynasty of collapsed. Administrative tablets stop abruptly, debts go unpaid, canals fill with silt. It was not apocalypse but exhaustion, the slow failure of an overextended system. Climate amplified weakness, politics finished the rest. Sumer, did not disappear so much as dissolve, absorbed into later powers like Babylon. Its language survived only in temples and archives, preserved by scribes as sacred code long after it was spoken. Step back now and observe how these 5 elements interlock, the scribe recording barley in cuneiform, the ruler legitimizing power through mythic succession, the temple aligning its ziggurat to the sun, the priest reciting hymns of human origin, the farmer depending on the river's moods. Together they reveal a civilization sustained by interconnected systems rather than miracles. Sumer's legacy is not mystery, but structure, the realization that what we call civilization emerges from the integration of technology, theology, architecture, and water. When one thread weakens, the pattern must change. The continuity from the Anatolian hill to this Mesopotamian plain is conceptual, not genetic. In Göbekli Tepe, ritual preceded settlement. In Sumer, the temple organized both settlement and record. In both, humanity sought order by synchronizing its collective life with the heavens above. The materials differ. Carved limestone gives way to baked clay, but the impulse remains to centralize memory, to align labor with cosmos. Archaeologists make no claim of direct descent between these sites, yet the resonance is clear. The human drive to ritualize cooperation runs deeper than the invention of cities. And yet, writing did not illuminate everything. Even with tens of thousands of tablets, not all voices survive. Beyond the monumental cities, there existed settlements without palaces, without defensive walls, without grand temples, places where authority was diffuse, embedded within households rather than concentrated in ziggurats. Those quieter sites challenge every assumption about hierarchy and progress, because if Sumer represents the model of vertical order, gods above, kings beneath, scribes recording it all, another civilization, older and farther north, demonstrates the opposite, a city without streets, without rulers, whose rooftops formed both passage and community. That, then, is where the path now turns. Northward, across millennia, toward a plateau of central Anatolia, where mud brick houses touched one another, like cells in a living organism. There, power did not rise skyward, it moved horizontally through shared walls and rooftops. Because if Sumer taught you that words became administration and temples became the axis of the world, the next lost city will show you how community can thrive without visible hierarchy, how civilization can grow inward rather than upward. The lesson waits in the superimposed layers of a place called Çatalhöyük, where the city quite literally walked upon itself. Shift the axis from ziggurats to the weave of the household, and what appears is not a grand avenue or an acropolis, but a city that quite literally walks over itself. You stand on a plateau in central Anatolia, and where you expect streets, you see rooftops. Where you expect doors at ground level, you see roof hatches. Where you expect plazas, you see continuous terraces, functioning as elevated corridors. That inversion is the first thing to hold steady in your mind. At Çatalhöyük, houses were built wall to wall. Circulation happened across the roofs via ladders. Main entrances opened from above, and exterior facades were nearly blind to the outside world. Archaeologists have documented layer upon layer of houses rebuilt in the same footprints, so the city is quite literally a vertical stack of homes accumulated across centuries. As you walk those roofs in your mind, it becomes clear the absence of streets is not a charming quirk, but a total reorganization of living. Movement, security, smoke ventilation, and access control all rerouted through the top of the dwelling. If this were merely an architectural trick, you could note it and move on, but combined with interior layout, it becomes a politics of space. Inside, packed clay and gypsum platforms map sleeping, cooking, and working zones. Beneath those platforms, the dead were interred with beads, pigments, and personal goods. This is where the second strand demands attention. Across the site, there are no palaces, no conspicuous civic buildings, no fortifications that proclaim command. What you find instead is the repeated rhythm of a domestic unit, with broadly similar dimensions, some with special rooms, yes, but without architecture that enforces visible hierarchy. Specialists consistently point out the absence of throne rooms or temples, segregated from the fabric of houses. When ritual appears, it appears inside the home. Many scholars read this as a relative architectural egalitarianism, at least in terms of space, where differences express themselves more in the biography of a given house than in a clean urban split between rich and poor. In that sense, the city does not look upward to a dominating building. It looks sideways, multiplying itself. Once the scene is set, you still have to ask how a community without formal inscriptions communicates meaning and memory so insistently. White plastered walls were repainted again and again. Between those coats you see hands stenciled in pigment, geometric figures, felines, bucrania, bull skulls fixed into niches, and stylized hunting scenes. From this emerges a third clue, and it is the most delicate because it tempts you to step past the evidence. Some researchers carefully suggest that certain recurring signs and motifs may have functioned as a proto-notational system, a rudimentary proto-writing linked to tallies, seasonal cycles, or house genealogies. Others prefer a stricter reading, an organized iconography with no phonetic value. The debate remains open, and it should. There are persistent graphic patterns, planned visual arrangements, and a clear intention to memorialize, replastering the same spots and repainting the same emblems, yet no consensus that these signs constitute writing in the strict sense. That tension is the useful takeaway. The house decorates, remembers, and points, but the code behind that pointing cannot yet be read as language. As you look closer at those walls, a constellation of objects interrupts you. In niches and on platforms sit bucrania and mounted horns. Above all, human figurines in clay, many female with ample forms, sometimes seated as if enthroned, sometimes flanked by felines. This fourth thread is among the most cited and the most misunderstood outside scholarship. Early excavators popularized the idea of a Neolithic mother goddess at Çatalhöyük, and it is undeniable that the frequency and context of certain figurines, together with the bull's prominence, point toward ritual complexes centered on fertility, life cycles, and abundance. Even so, recent excavation has tempered the older enthusiasm. The figurine corpus includes males and animals. Many pieces are broken, reused, or casually discarded. Their distribution is uneven. What can be said with confidence is that symbolic practices focused on reproduction, death, and the regeneration of the house were common with female figurines in contexts that look ritual. To crown that with a capitalized mother goddess, however, risks projecting a unified theology the archaeological record does not warrant. The firm ground is this: the repeated presence of female figurines and bucrania in domestic ritual contexts. The prudent inference is that households staged rites around continuity and renewal. Meanwhile, the house itself, treated almost like a living organism, reveals how present and ancestors interlocked. Multiple burials beneath platforms, including some skulls removed and remodeled with plaster and pigment, emphasize a continuity between the living and the dead. The dwelling becomes tomb, altar, and workshop at once, and the artificial mound, the tell, is nothing more than generations sedimented in place, rebuilding over their dead and fusing memory with everyday life under one slab of floor. That fusion of funerary and domestic helps explain why dedicated temples were unnecessary. Whatever you call cult here is inscribed within the room you replaster and repaint. You still need an ending though, because endings speak as loudly as beginnings. When the settlement thins out in the 6th millennial BCE, there is no widespread ash layer, no walls shattered by ancient siege engines, no debris that screams assault. What dominates is the signature of a slow dimming, and that fifth observation has its force precisely in what it lacks. There is no evidence of city-killing war. Instead, signals point to environmental shifts, pressure on resources, crowding and sanitation issues, and outward movement toward other settlements. Microscopic residues and soil analyses suggest accumulating refuse, insects and pathogens in closed spaces. Waste management practices may not have kept pace with density. Nearby plots could have degraded, and the long-lived rooftop circulation, effective for centuries, may have become less sustainable than more dispersed alternatives. The city does not fall, it dissolves. That mode of vanishing, without a single violent episode, says much about how tightly coupled systems can fray when background conditions change gradually. Thread the 5 lines together, and the fabric holds. Architecture without streets, reorganizing mobility and social life, the absent palace implying that power, or the sacred operated from the domestic cell, an insistent iconography whose exact code eludes us, but that plainly performs memory, figurines and bucrania pointing to fertility, death, and renewal, without a monumental clergy, and a quiet ending that illustrates how settlements can decline through the erosion of small things. That coherence forces a revision of categories. There is urbanism without avenues, ritual without temples, community without palaces. More sharply, it suggests a powerful idea. A city can be a pattern of houses acting as units of meaning rather than anonymous bricks in a central plan. Still, it's wise to resist the pull of idealization. Architectural parity does not equal social equality. Osteological studies show variation in diet and workload, the presence of history houses, dwellings with more burials and richer decoration, hints at accumulated prestige. Nor was this a conflict-free utopia. Repeated repairs, thick stacks of plaster, horn mount anchors, and hearth relocations point to practical tensions solved with craft and patience. What's remarkable is that none of these pressures produced a separate building that policed civic life or monopolized ritual. That persistent choice or habit distinguishes Çatalhöyük from the models that felt familiar before you climbed onto its roofs. For all its endurance, however, the domestic city does not show the kind of order you will find elsewhere, where grids, drains, standardized bricks, and street widths signal an explicit will to plan and rule. If here you walk across roofs and read walls, farther east you will encounter brickwork lattices with private baths, household drains, covered sewers that stitch whole neighborhoods together, and a silence just as eloquent. No recorded battles, no kings boasted in stone, and yet an order that pulses from block to block. That comparison, one you haven't made yet and already feel, opens the door to the next stop, where attention to water and module will reach a precision that seems to belong to a much later age. Because if Çatalhöyük taught you that a city can be a house repeated to the horizon, the Indus Valley will show you how a city can be organized water, calibrated brick, and shared drainage long before Rome ever dreamt of sewers. And that contrast, so crisp and yet so contemporary in its logic, is exactly what keeps the enigma of lost civilizations alive. The contrast strikes instantly. On the Anatolian plateau, you walked across rooftops. Here the city demands that you think downward, from the ground into the earth. You stand at a corner of baked brick and hear the faint murmur of water beneath your feet. It isn't a stream of nature, but the echo of an engineered plan cutting through whole city blocks. That murmur leads you to the first fact of this chapter, the one that anchors Mohenjo-Daro's fame in indisputable material evidence. Beneath its streets, and connected house to house, lies one of the world's oldest and most extensive urban drainage and sewage networks. Nearly every major dwelling had a bathing area or washing space. Wastewater flowed through lined conduits into covered drains capped at regular intervals with inspection lids. Where slope demanded it, builders inserted vertical shafts to slow the water's force, and at corners, carefully fitted joints prevented leakage. It isn't a patchwork of improvisations, it's a system. And what's most eloquent isn't its scale but its coherence, the way it ties the private to the communal, from the household floor to the neighborhood channel, from neighborhood to main artery. So when you stand before the so-called Great Bath, a rectangular pool waterproofed with bitumen, fitted with stairways and drains, you understand that it wasn't a luxury monument, but the civic heart of hydraulic logic. If water explains the city's inner rhythm, the grid explains its outer shape. Just a few blocks away, under the high sun, the geometry of the shadows reveals the second defining element: modular planning. Main streets run at right angles, blocks keep intelligible proportions, houses vary within a consistent template. The bricks themselves follow a recurring ratio, 1:4 in thickness, width and length, allowing walls to interlock predictably and resist wear. Archaeologists have measured alignments that follow a broad orthogonal pattern adapted to terrain and have recorded standardized weights, enabling trade with repeatable measures. None of this requires a palace to explain it. The evidence supports a civic authority, perhaps collective, perhaps segmented, capable of enforcing codes of construction and maintenance. You move through the lower city and the citadel, modern terms, not proof of caste or class, and in both, the same pulse of order persists. The wonder grows not because you find inscriptions or stelae praising kings, but because you don't. No boast, no colossal temple towering apart from the streets, just a grid rebuilt house by house, drain by drain, as if planning itself were a social habit, not a ruler's decree. In a city where engineering becomes landscape, fascination breeds myth. The third strand to face here emerges from the 20th century's appetite for wonder. The claim that human remains at Mohenjo-Daro show unusual radiation, that its walls are vitrified by some ancient nuclear blast. The persistence of that myth rests on misread photographs and misinterpreted data. Radiological studies show normal background levels. Osteological analysis places many skeletons in positions consistent with sudden death during urban collapse, floods, disease, or brief violence, but not with catastrophic heat. The walls themselves bear the marks of erosion, fire, and structural failure, none of vitrification. Serious archaeology rejects the atomic shortcut and returns to what the record actually reveals: a complex multifactorial decline, slow in the aggregate, abrupt only in local episodes. Recognizing this doesn't diminish Mohenjo-Daro's mystery. It grounds it, reminding you that its true marvel lies in the tension between technical mastery and environmental vulnerability. That tension leads naturally to the fourth fact: the slow dusk of the Indus Valley civilization around 1900 BCE. The upper strata of Mohenjo-Daro show simplification in layout, drainage neglect, declining brick quality, and modest reoccupations. Zooming out, paleoclimate data reveal a weakening monsoon and increasing aridity, combined with shifting river courses, diversions, branchings, even disappearances. These changes undermine the agricultural stability that had sustained urban life. Soil salinization from over-irrigation without adequate drainage likely worsened matters. Trade routes shifted too. The Indus once exported carnelian, pearls and textiles to Mesopotamia. When demand fell and internal transport grew costlier under drought, the system faltered. Archaeological layers record abandonment patterns, empty quarters, dispersed settlements, dietary changes. The remarkable thing isn't that it ended, but how. No invader's signature carved in stone, no conquest layer, just the erosion of complexity until the urban fabric thinned beyond recognition. If you weave these four threads together, the pattern is unmistakable. A city that treated water as its spine and built channels flexible enough for centuries of use. A grid that needed no proclamation, only discipline. A modern myth that dissolves under evidence, and an ending that reminds you no engineering, however refined, is immune to climate and time. The script has no named heroes, yet it feels profoundly human. The story of countless hands performing small, repetitive acts, placing a brick, sealing a joint, clearing a drain, that together sustained a vast and silent urban life. And the silence itself speaks twice. There's the literal hush of covered drains through which the city whispered its technical language, and there's the silence of an undeciphered script, the seals and tablets of the Indus civilization, whose signs still resist translation. You cannot read their words, but you can read their systems, and in doing so you glimpse a form of modernity, unbound by time, a collective intelligence measured not by conquest, but by coordination, by standardization, by the belief that private hygiene and public order belong to the same organism. You linger a moment longer by the Great Bath, wondering how a city so advanced could rise without a visible temple or a king's carved face. The answer is almost disarmingly plain: agreements, trades, inspectors, traditions of craftsmanship, civic habits transmitted as technique. If that sounds unromantic, look again at the drains. They pulse with quiet ethics, prevention of disease, care after rain, repair without glory. It's no coincidence that the next leg of this journey will also hinge on the meeting point between the sacred and the technical, where water once again dictates life and calendar. Only this time, that meeting unfolds before the pharaohs carve their faces in stone. For in the sands of Upper Egypt, long before the familiar names of dynasties, the Nile was already shaping tombs and channels, marking calendars in the stars, and teaching that water could become the foundation of a state. Because if here, in Mohenjo-Daro, water made an anonymous city, there, in the Nile Valley, it will make a civilization's founding story, and that transition from drainage to dynasty waits upriver, where writing is still a promise, and power still an experiment. Follow the river back toward its administrative source, before the names you know dominate the king lists, and the landscape forces you to examine small things: perforated ivory tags, incised marks on pottery, repeating emblems painted on standards. The first thing you'll notice, and the foundation of this stretch, is that the Naqada culture phases I3 C4000 3000 BCE. In late Naqada Su 3 contexts, most famously at Abydos, Tomb UJ, you find tiny bone and ivory labels tied to imported jars, incised with marks that identify contents, provenance, or intended recipients. Certain emblems reappear with such regularity that, by the end of the 4th millennium, they cross a threshold into something more stable, the system that will become early Egyptian writing. Specialists resist forcing the timeline. They speak of proto-hieroglyphs, not full orthographies, but they do recognize discrete graphic units with distinct values. For practical purposes, that's what matters here. You can see a visual lexicon forming in the service of accounting and palace memory, decades before dynastic unification and monumental inscriptions. It is not literature, it is logistics, and precisely for that reason, it is a foundation. Those signs and record-keeping habits don't float in a vacuum, just meters from those tags. In the cemetery of Qab, Abydos, tombs surface that are not simple village pits, but compounds with multiple chambers, annexed storerooms, and grave goods that advertise rank. This is where the second solid piece of the mosaic appears, royal traits before Nama. In the proto-dynastic layers at Abydos, burials of individuals whose names are framed in serex, that heraldic panel that will crown Egyptian kingship, start to appear. Figures such as Irihor and Ka, and the debated scorpion, possibly more than one, show up on seals and vessels. These tombs display practices that later become standard in the dynastic period: animal interments, or deposits as part of ritual, storerooms with imported wine and oil, evidence of assigned personnel. You are not yet facing pyramids or textbook names, but you are looking at the spatial and symbolic vocabulary of power taking shape. A funerary precinct that manages goods, represents authority through emblems, and coordinates by means of signs. In other words, royal forms don't appear in a single year zero. They are grown, tested, and recognized at Abydos before Nama. At this point, the label many handbooks use, Dynasty Zero, demands careful handling. The third piece is conceptual. The category exists, but it is an Egyptological construct to organize a phase, not a native term, and not a dynasty formalized by Egyptians themselves. Coined in the 20th century for Naqada III rulers, Su 3200, prior to the first dynasty, it groups kings like Irihor, Ka, and Scorpion II, sometimes even Nama at the threshold. Some researchers find it useful to describe political continuity and experiments in statehood. Others prefer Proto-dynastic period, avoiding a numbered dynasty that might imply a coherence the record cannot guarantee. Factually, it is safer to stick with what's measurable: identifiable rulers, symbols of authority, exchange networks, and a funerary architecture that centralizes resources. Calling it Dynasty Zero helps orientation. Treating it as definitive can obscure the overlaps and transitions that actually occurred. The debate isn't a defect, it shows how the very notion of origins gets built. While the valley coalesces, the seemingly empty western desert contributes a datum whose age and restraint illuminate the bond between sky and earth in this story. The fourth observation takes you to Nabta Playa, a now arid basin southwest of Aswan that, in the mid-Holocene, held seasonal lakes. There, pastoral groups erected stone circles, alignments, and small megalithic structures, oriented to mark the solar cycle, especially the summer solstice. These are not Atlantic-style monoliths, but modest avenues and cromlechs, whose layout signals calendar events crucial for managing water and herds. Dating places these works in the 6th to 5th millennia BCE, long before any pharaoh. Their importance to you is double. First, they show that communities in Upper Egypt and its periphery already thought about time in celestial terms to organize daily life. Second, they anticipate a sensibility you'll later see in temples and urban axes, aligning the human with the sky. Unlike late mythic narratives, the sky here doesn't legitimize a king. It announces the reigns. The astronomy is sober and functional, fitting neatly with the fabric that is taking shape downstream. What remains is the thread that explains why these dispersed elements, tags, proto-dynastic tombs, desert alignments, form not a loose constellation, but a road. The fifth accumulated evidence is cultural continuity into dynastic Upper Egypt. Motifs, practices, and technologies pass, with adjustments into the official stage. Boats painted on Nakada ceramics and rock art become the naval iconography accompanying kings. Tribal standards consolidate into nome emblems. Serex that identified earlier rulers at Abydos transform into the royal cartouche's ancestor on stone, and seals, the administration that tagged wine in Uj, expands into a bureaucracy capable of taxing and redistributing at scale. Even funerary patterns, tomb orientation, storage deposits, the relationship between enclosure and necropolis persist, now magnified by an authority with broader territorial reach. There is no clean cut, there is a ramp. When Nama appears as the agent of unification, he does not invent the grammar, he regularizes it and imposes it more widely. Much of what you recognize as pharaonic is the scaled-up repertoire already rehearsed. Place the 5 pieces in sequence, and the picture turns sharp without losing mystery. First, a proto-visual language of tags and tallies makes long-distance, long-duration memory possible. Then, tombs with emblems stage authority before the title pharaoh exists. In the middle, a modern category, Dynasty Zero, that organizes but also simplifies, reminding you that categories are tools, not dogmas. Off to the west, a desert-turned lake-bed where modest stones mark the sun's pulse for when water arrives. And finally, the glue continuity that binds it all, the passage from habit to institution, from marks to writing, from elite burial to state ideology. History, you realize, advances less by miracles than by accumulated solutions that suddenly lock together at a larger scale. That accumulation also corrects the most persistent simplifications. Predynastic Egypt is often imagined as a waiting room for real history to begin with. Dynasty 1. But when you give Nakada, Hierakonpolis, and Abydos their due attention, you see political and technical laboratories at work, stone workshops, standardizing forms, potters replicating boats, animals, and standards with a recognizable convention, artisans. You also see competition and fusion, Upper Egyptian factions extending influence toward the delta, nodes that grow and yield in turn, rites hybridizing along the way. When you finally look at the Nama palette, It feels less like a creation ex nihilo and more like the epilogue to a centuries-long process. The practical result of understanding this segment is that before the pharaohs stops being a pale prologue and turns into a field of forces that explain what follows. Treating Dynasty 0 as a useful provisional label inoculates you against presentism. You neither romanticize a pure, stateless past, nor equate the absence of pyramids with the absence of complex organization. You also recognize that the sky at Nabta Playa already functioned as a clock, that the Serek was already in rehearsal as a signature, that the humble tag already articulated accountable memory, and perhaps you're struck by how modern this prehistory feels, rational in its solutions, pragmatic, experimental. Pragmatism does not exclude myth. It prepares it. When the state claims the sea as road and commerce as lifeblood, imagery sails, bulls, serpents, goddesses, kings who master the labyrinth of water. On the far side of the eastern Mediterranean, a civilization will build palaces that are cities, drainage that are promises, frescoes that turn technique into rite. Its principal script will remain mute to us, just as Abydos's first signs were mute, until context made them legible. Its end will be scripted in fire and sea, its glory in trade. You have watched the symbols of power come to life. Now you will see power turn symbol into palace. Because if Upper Egypt taught you the ramp toward kingship, on an island in the Aegean, you will see a system that, from the center of a labyrinth, ordered seas and myth until the earth shook and the sea came in. That is the threshold opening as you cross into the next section. The Aegean Sea isn't meant to be admired from the shore. It's meant to be sailed, measured in islands, currents, and winds. As you approach Crete and the ruins of Knossos emerge among the olive trees, what you feel first is order, an order that seems born of dance rather than calculation. Corridors twist and branch, courtyards breathe light from above, passageways slice through walls to let in breeze and shadow. There, architecture itself gives you the first firm testimony of this chapter, the Palace of Knossos and its drainage system, both so advanced for their time that even the later Greeks couldn't resist turning them into myth. Subterranean conduits with carefully engineered gradients, settling shafts, clay pipelines leading from private bathrooms to covered drains, an ensemble built in the 2nd millennium BCE when much of Europe still lived behind wooden palisades. Hydraulic engineering and interior climate control define the Minoan character as much as the bull imagery does. Archaeologists emphasize how light, air, and water were integrated by design, making the palaces living machines, regulators of climate and movement. In that light, Labyrinth ceases to be a metaphor. It becomes an architectural description. That sense of controlled flow extends into administration and writing. On clay tablets, preserved only because fire baked them, appear the signs of an undeciphered script. Linear A. From it derives, according to consensus, the Linear B script later used by the Mycenaeans, Greek in language but Minoan in ancestry. The second major fact is this: the persistence of a written code used between roughly the 18th and 15th centuries BCE to manage goods and rituals whose actual content remains unknown. Epigraphers have catalogued hundreds of symbols, identified accounting formulas and recurring patterns, yet none correspond to any known language. Still, typological comparison makes clear that Linear A served a centralized bureaucracy, able to record transactions and offerings. Its silence doesn't obscure its purpose, it clarifies it. There was writing, and therefore administration, even if translation eludes us. The mystery is not a romantic void, it's a reminder of prudence. The Minoan world spoke only. We have yet to understand its words. Beyond the palace, the sea imposes another rhythm, frescoes from Knossos and Akrotiri. Its Cycladic counterpart display fleets, dolphins, processions. Blue dominates, bulls return in endless motion. Suddenly the third thread, geological rather than artistic, comes into focus. In the heart of the Aegean, on the island of Thera, modern Santorini, a colossal eruption in the mid-15th century BCE, buried Akrotiri beneath ash. Radiocarbon dating and marine cores confirm the scale, one of the largest eruptions in human history, releasing enough energy to generate tsunamis that battered the Cretan coast. Destruction layers at Knossos and other sites, fires, abandonment, and disruption align with that catastrophe and the economic crises that followed. The eruption of Thera, beyond its geological spectacle, reveals the fragility of a civilization dependent on the sea it mastered. The same water that united its islands turned against them. Studies of sediments and petrified tree rings erase doubt about the event's magnitude. What remains debated is how long the aftermath lasted. The myth did not exaggerate the disaster, it translated it into human language. And here enters the fourth line, where history and myth touch without merging. From Plato onward, the idea of an advanced maritime civilization, drowned by divine wrath, has searched for its reflection in the Minoan memory. In Timaeus and Critias, the story of Atlantis unfolds, a prosperous island empire punished by the gods and swallowed in a day and a night. The parallels with Thera's destruction are tempting. A palatial culture of seafarers and traders, refined and suddenly gone, a cataclysm of fire and sea, Greek recollections of a mysterious Cretan past. Historians do not conflate the two, but acknowledge that Plato may have drawn on an ancestral echo. In the 20th century, archaeologist Spiridon Marinatus openly championed the equation Thera Atlantis, while others kept their distance. For you, the point is not to solve the myth, but to see how Minoan reality produced an echo strong enough to become a moral allegory centuries later. What the gods in Plato's tale punish is not Knossos's pride, but humanity's forgetfulness of balance with nature. After the volcanic roar, history quiets, but the ruins continue to speak. The upper layers at Knossos reveal reoccupation by Mycenaean peoples, who turned temples into storerooms and sanctuaries into fortresses. That's the fifth and final fact here. The abrupt collapse around 1450 BCE and the cultural transition that followed. Archaeological records show systematic destruction across Cretan palaces, not only Knossos but Phaistos, Malaya, Zakros, and a gap in pottery production and administrative archives. Linear B appears soon after, probably introduced by Mycenaean Greeks who filled the vacuum left by Minoan decline. Partial continuity in cults and styles suggests that local populations survived, absorbed into new centers of power. Structurally, the palatial system that had merged production, religion, and trade unraveled, and with it political cohesion. From then on, Crete ceased to be the axis of the known world, and became one island among many, its memory diffused into legends of labyrinths and bull kings. Thread these 5 moments into one line, and an arc of equilibrium and loss emerges. First, mastery of technique, the house that breathes and channels water. Next, the codification of that mastery into a script that manages but conceals. Then, the eruption's fire, testing the endurance of maritime networks. Afterward, the transformation of that disaster into myth, Atlantis as a moral mirror. And finally, the silent institutional end of a system that once seemed eternal. The Minoan mystery lies not in its disappearance, but in its way of living, open to the sea, unwalled, visibly without armies, founded on trade and symbol. That choice, so different from the continental fortress model, was its strength and its undoing. Walking through the reconstructed halls of Knossos, in your mind, you realize the so-called bull culture was not an obsession with violence, but a language of energy and cycle. The paintings of youths vaulting over bulls, the inverted columns swelling upward like living trunks, the warm colors and marine motifs, all speak of a worldview integrating risk and celebration. None of it survived intact after Thera, yet in the collective memory of the Aegean, the mold remained, the labyrinth as a symbol of power and loss. From here the cultural route bends westward. Beyond the inner sea lies a kingdom of sunset and metallic rivers. Another enigma, a civilization known to Greeks and Phoenicians, rich and then erased from maps. Its metals fed myth, its ruins inspired quests as stubborn as Atlantis. That next stop in the lands of southwestern Iberia will echo Minoan brilliance on Earth, a culture poised between fact and legend. Tartessos, recorded only as a rumour of wealth and disappearance. Because if Crete showed you how a labyrinth could be real, and a myth born of stone and fire, the next chapter will show you that a myth can also be born of gold and silence. The rumour of mines and a golden west travelled across the ancient world long before anyone could draw the edge of it on a map. Follow the Mediterranean's curve toward the Pillars of Hercules, and the names shift, the light thickens. Beyond the strait, the ancients placed a land of silver rivers and red metals, a kingdom that traded with Phoenicians and Greeks, and then dissolved, leaving no recognizable capital. There, where the Guadiana and Guadalquivir rivers flow toward the Atlantic, emerges the first firm fact of this chapter, the written testimonies that mention Tartessos. Herodotus, Avienus, and Strabo describe it as a wealthy, civilized region, with ancient laws and a king named Argantonius, legendary for his longevity and generosity toward the Greeks. Phoenician sources and later fragments point to intense trade in metals, silver, tin, gold, and a culture organized enough to host Greek expeditions. None of these accounts are contemporary with Tartessos itself, but their convergence reveals a persistent memory of a power active in southwestern Iberia between the 9th and 6th centuries BCE. That textual thread finds partial confirmation in the second kind of evidence, archaeology tied to mining wealth and commerce. Across Hulvar, the Guadalquivir Valley, and the Guadiana Basin, excavations since the mid-20th century have uncovered ancient smelting sites, metallurgical workshops, grave goods, and Phoenician objects within indigenous layers. The treasure of El Carambolo, discovered near Seville in 1958, its necklaces, bracelets, and gold plaques, exquisitely crafted, embodied a fusion of local and Near Eastern styles, signaling intense contact with Phoenician colonies such as Gardia, modern Cadiz. Isotopic studies have confirmed exploitation of ore deposits in the peritic belt of Hulvar and Rio Tinto since the late Bronze Age, with exports reaching the eastern Mediterranean. This material convergence strengthens the case for a complex society structured around mineral wealth and fluvial routes, capable of producing surpluses and trading far beyond its shores. The brilliance of Tartessos, then, was not fable, but geology made visible. Still, the splendor described by ancient authors raises a question that refuses to settle. Where are the ruins of this city or its capital? Here lies the third dimension of the mystery. Surveys around the rivers, now identified with the Tartessian, the Guadalquivir for some, the Guadiana for others, have revealed sites such as El Carambolo, Tejada la Vieja, and Casas del Turuñuelo, each showing traits that could fit a palatial or urban center, yet none conclusive. At Casas del Turuñuelo, adobe structures, bullhide-shaped altars, and evidence of animal sacrifices, dated to the 5th century BCE, suggest a ritual of closure. The building was deliberately burned and sealed, as though the community had decided to bury its own past. That layer of ash and silence makes the site both metaphor and fact, a civilization not destroyed by invaders, but seemingly self-extinguished, whether by design or transformation. The fourth strand widens the scope. Beyond Hulvar and Badajoz, geoarchaeologists and fluvial scientists have examined how landscape changes, river course shifts, marsh sedimentation, sea level rise may have erased Tartessos' port. In Doñana, under estuarine deposits, topographic anomalies have been detected, interpreted by some as possible human structures. Excavations have yet to confirm a submerged city, but paleoenvironmental data show that between the 9th and 6th centuries BCE, the delta was a dynamic network of lagoons and channels, vulnerable to flooding that could have displaced populations and ports. The disappearance of Tartessos thus reads less like apocalypse and more like ecological and economic transition. The wealth that fed its power, metal, drew Phoenician colonization. The trade that sustained it changed hands. The shifting land covered its traces with silt. What vanished was not a kingdom, it was a network. Yet the echo it left was immense. In Greek memory, Tartessos marked the edge of the civilized world, the threshold where the sea opened into the unknown ocean. Its king, Argantonius, became a figure of wisdom and impossible age, a monarch who welcomed strangers and stored silver without measure. Remarkably, no other Western land was described with such familiarity by archaic Greek writers. This persistence of a name without a visible city forms the core of the enigma, a culture that lived long enough to enter the mental maps of the Mediterranean, yet left so few ruins that each later century reinvented it. Out of that archaeological silence grew competing theories, some linking it to Plato's Atlantis, others tracing it as the seed of later Iberian and Turdetanian cultures. The cautious historians favour the latter, citing ceramic and scriptural continuities. The dreamers favour the former, convinced that a kingdom so rich must have met a fittingly tragic fate. Even with a critical eye, it's hard to ignore the poetry of coincidence, a metallurgical civilization at the western edge of the ancient world. Disappearing without trace around the same century, myths spoke of lands lost beyond the sea. The difference is simple and profound. Tartessos was real. Its metals fed the economies of the eastern Mediterranean. Its rivers linked Iberia to Phoenician and Greek networks, and its fading, though veiled in mystery, can be traced in the sediments of its rivers. Viewed together, the evidence forms a coherent picture. First, the textual record confirming existence and contact with the Hellenic world. Next, the mining wealth explaining its rise. Then, the archaeological sites revealing its material presence and ritual endings. And finally, the mutable landscape that erased its geography. The question is no longer whether Tartessos existed, but how a name vanishes when earth and water conspire to bury it. It did not fall to the sword, it fell to silt and commerce. As the sun lowers over the Atlantic, this image of a legendary West merges with the memory of other civilizations, resurrected only when their inscriptions are read again. Between the tablets once dismissed as biblical myth and the ruins later confirmed by excavation lies one example that redefined the ancient Near East, an empire of Anatolia, long thought to be scribal fiction, rediscovered and proven real. That is your next stop, the land of the Hittites, the people who fused iron and writing, rivaled Egypt, and then vanished from history until their words were read 3 millennia later. Because if Tartessos represents the mystery of a story without ruins, the Hittites will show you the reverse, ruins without a story, until someone learned to read them again. Across the Anatolian plateau, where winters bleach the hills and summers turn the stone walls red, a 19th century traveller stumbled upon strange ruins covered in inscriptions no one could read. For centuries the name Hittite had been a ghost in biblical texts, a people mentioned among the allies and enemies of Israel, but with no trace on any real map. That disconnection between myth and discovery forms the first solid point of this chapter, the rediscovery of the Hittites, and the deciphering of their tablets, which resurrected an empire thought to exist only in scripture. In 1906, excavations at Boghaz-Köy, modern-day Hattusa, Turkey, uncovered thousands of cuneiform tablets, written in an unknown Indo-European tongue. It was philologist Bedřich Hrozný who, in 1915, read the phrase Nuashi Vatar, you drink water, and proved the language was an ancestor of Indo-European. Overnight, an empire once reduced to a biblical rumour emerged complete with archives, laws, treaties and myths. The silence of the Old Testament filled with administrative voices, priests, scribes and kings signing accords with Egypt. This first fact, then, is not merely an archaeological event, but the literal rescue of a civilization from the dust of its own tablets. That rediscovery opened the way to grasp the empire's true scale. Around the 14th century BCE, the Hittites ruled a vast state stretching from central Anatolia to northern Syria, its capital at Hattusa. The recovered tablets describe vassal treaties, temple inventories, lists of offerings, and codified laws. Yet what stands out and marks the second crucial fact is their early and deliberate use of iron, Long before the metal spread across the Mediterranean, the Hittites mastered forging and tempering techniques that gave them an advantage in tools and weaponry. Evidence from Çatalhöyük and textual references confirm iron's symbolic and strategic value, reserved for ritual and royal use. It was not mass industry but technology charged with sacred power, the metal of the gods, a symbol of strength and legitimacy. In that fusion of metallurgy and ideology, the Hittites stood as a bridge between the Bronze and Iron Ages. The power structure these tablets reveal extended far beyond Anatolia. They speak of wars, embassies, and treaties among the great empires of the Late Bronze Age. Among them, one document gleams above all others: the peace treaty between Pharaoh Ramesses II and King Hattusili III, circa 1259 BCE, the world's first known international treaty. Copies survive in both Egyptian hieroglyphs and Akkadian cuneiform, sealing an alliance after decades of conflict, including the famous Battle of Kadesh. This third fact is more than a diplomatic anecdote. It shows the emergence of a codified diplomacy, a mutual recognition between powers. The treaty, with clauses on extradition, alliance, and divine oath, portrays the Hittites as equals in a system of law and balance. In their own words, the two rulers addressed each other as great brothers, a phrase of respect and parity. The peace may not have lasted, but the text endures as proof of a political maturity that saw legality itself as a tool of empire. But the splendor of those archives and treaties dissolved almost as swiftly as it appeared. Around 1200 BCE, Hittite cities burned or emptied, and their empire fragmented. The causes of that collapse form the fourth fact. The final tablets speak of cascading crises, prolonged droughts, invasions by the so-called Sea Peoples, internal revolts, and a breakdown of trade routes. Records from Ugarit and other Levantine cities mention ships destroyed and ports in flames. Across Anatolia, layers of ash mark destruction, not from one catastrophe, but from repeated blows. The empire's palace system collapsed under combined internal and external stress. What followed was silence. The Hittite language vanished, its descendants, the Neo-Hittite states, surviving only as small kingdoms in Syria. For nearly 3 millennia, their name disappeared. When the Bible mentioned them, it was as a faint echo with no geography. That long oblivion made their modern rediscovery feel like resurrection. Even then, the rediscovery raised a fifth, still unsettled question. What truly became of the Hittites? Did they vanish, or merely transform? Epigraphic evidence points to a second life. Hieroglyphic Luwian inscriptions, written in a sister language, appear across cities like Carchemish, Melid, and Aleppo, dated between the 12th and 8th centuries BCE. These reveal successor states maintaining Hittite art, gods, and language long after Hattusa fell. The thunder god Tarhunt and the sun goddess of Arina still received offerings. Scholars debate whether to call these realms a continuation or an echo, but the cultural thread endured long enough to influence later Assyrian and Aramean traditions. Civilizations, it seems, rarely die cleanly. They fade into other tongues. Seen from a distance, the Hittite arc reads like a complete cycle of civilization: emergence, expansion, diplomacy, collapse, and rediscovery. Each stage teaches a lesson. The archaeological resurrection reminds us how easily a culture can vanish when its archives are unreadable. Their iron mastery shows that technology, while empowering, also binds fate to its secrets. The treaty with Egypt reveals an empire capable of translating war into law. The sudden collapse warns that even law cannot guard against global disarray, and the partial survival of the Luwian kingdoms demonstrates that no civilization ends, it transforms. Perhaps the most haunting element is their absence from memory. While Egypt and Mesopotamia lived on in Greek and Roman minds, the Hittites vanished so thoroughly that even their capital's name was forgotten. For centuries, Hattusa's cyclopean walls and lion gates were taken for nameless ruins. Their story proves the irony of writing, that even what is inscribed can disappear if no one remembers how to read it. When Hrosny cracked their code, he did more than translate. He restored a civilization to the human narrative. Walking today through the reconstructed gates of Hattusa, you can still trace carved lists of gods and laws, kings' names and festivals. Yet what moves you most is not the stone but the silence that followed, the 15 centuries when no one knew who had lived here. The ruins, now explained, still whisper that forgetting is the most powerful force of all. As you travel southward, the air grows warmer, and the memory of ziggurats and treaties gives way to colossal faces carved in volcanic stone. In the jungles of another continent, a different people sculpted their enigmas without words, a mirror to the Hittite paradox, knowledge without decipherment, meaning trapped in stone. Because if the Hittites were a civilization rediscovered through their writing, what awaits next is one that still keeps its silence, the Olmecs, whose gigantic heads gaze through the centuries, speaking a language we have yet to hear. The air of the Gulf of Mexico feels heavier where jungle meets clay and river. Along the banks of the Coatzacoalcos and Tonelá rivers, the earth keeps the faces of giants, stone visages, staring into no direction at all. No inscription accompanies their features, yet they speak louder than any written record could. Here, between Veracruz and Tabasco, begins one of the oldest stories of Mesoamerica, the Olmecs. Their history was not written, it was sculpted. The first fact in this chapter stands immovable. Those colossal basalt heads, some 3 meters tall and weighing over 20 tons, carved between the 14th and 10th centuries BCE. Each face is distinct, each headdress unique, suggesting individuality rather than idealized gods. The sheer labor of transporting those stones, some quarried over 100 kilometers away, reveals an organized power structure incompatible with the idea of scattered villages. Though their names are lost, the heads proclaim authority, monuments to hierarchy, to a power capable of shaping and symbolizing itself in stone. Intertwined with those sculptures runs another thread, the invention of time. The Olmecs are credited as the first to devise the Mesoamerican calendar, later refined by the Maya and Zapotecs. At sites like Tres Zapotes and La Venta, carved monuments bear numerical notations of bars and dots, the same vigesimal counting system that would later record celestial cycles and dynasties. One stela from Tres Zapotes contains the date 7 to 18 in the long count, equivalent to 31 BCE, demonstrating that the Olmecs already used a mathematical and astronomical framework anchored to a mythical beginning. In the absence of long texts, these numbers serve as proof of intellectual sophistication, a civilization capable of synchronizing agriculture, ritual, and cosmos. If the colossal heads embodied power, the calendar embodied permanence, the idea that human life must move to the rhythm of the heavens. Amid such precision, silence persists, a linguistic one. No complete inscription, no deciphered sentence remains. This leads to the third fact. Olmec writing, if it truly existed, remains undeciphered. Fragments such as the Cascahal block, a small tablet carved with abstract signs arranged in horizontal lines and dated to around 900 BCE, may represent the earliest writing in the Americas. Laboratory tests confirm its antiquity. Its symbols repeat in structured patterns, yet no other example has surfaced to reveal phonetic or syntactic rules. Scholars remain divided. Some see proto-writing or ritual markings, others a full writing system whose code we simply lack. What no one disputes is that the Olmecs mastered imagery as language. Jaguars, feathered serpents, hybrid human-feline figures, and motifs of fertility and transformation form a coherent iconography where image and word still shared the same essence. Try to picture daily life in La Venta or San Lorenzo, and the scale of their architecture restores perspective. Earthen pyramids and platforms rise in deliberate alignment. Plazas face solstice dawns. This fourth strand rests on precise measurements. Archaeologists have documented minimal deviations in site orientations, consistently around 8 degrees west of true north. a pattern repeated later by other Mesoamerican civilizations. Such regularity implies astronomical observation and a shared symbolic grammar. Olmec architecture was not mere backdrop, it was cosmology in clay, a spatial translation of celestial order. Their obsession with aligning heaven and earth, power and cosmos, opens the fifth and most controversial chapter, the theory of transoceanic contact. Since the 19th century, some writers have claimed African influence, arguing that the colossal heads display negroid features. Modern archaeology rejects this notion. The facial traits, broad noses, full lips, reflect regional physiognomy, not evidence of foreign contact. No genetic, material, or navigational data supports an old world connection. Yet the persistence of the debate reveals something else: the reluctance to accept that a fully indigenous American civilization could achieve such technical and artistic mastery independently. The controversy, rather than diminishing the Olmecs, magnifies them. Without outside influence, they created an entirely new aesthetic and ritual architecture of their own. Weaving these five threads, the stone giants, the calendar, the undeciphered signs, the astronomical design, and the myth of contact, you get a civilization of deep coherence. The Olmecs ruled through symbols, turned land into temple and time into measure. Their world was organized not by conquest, but by ceremony, not by armies, but by sacred hierarchy. Specialized workshops, long-distance jade and obsidian trade, and centralized ritual centers all prove this was no prelude to later powers, but a civilization in its own right. The true mystery lies not in their origin, but in their ending. By 400 BCE, their great centers were abandoned. San Lorenzo had already waned. Laventa was ritually dismantled, its monuments broken and buried with deliberate care. There is no evidence of foreign invasion, only environmental stress, shifting rivers, silting plains, exhausted soil. The jungle reclaimed its ground. What remains is a familiar pattern in human history, a society that ends its own myth before time does. The colossal heads left scattered across the floodplains are not ruins, they are memories given weight. Then it strikes you. The Olmec silence is not emptiness, it is method. Their way of preserving was to conceal, just as Göbekli Tepe was buried and Laventa covered. The oldest civilizations seem to share an impulse to protect memory through ritual closure, to hide the sacred rather than expose it. Perhaps when they sealed their temples, the Olmecs understood that their age was over and that their works must become part of the landscape. As the sun sinks over the gulf, that instinct to veil the sacred feels oddly familiar. Centuries later, across deserts joined by trade routes of incense and spice, another people would carve their sanctuaries not upon the earth, but into it, cities hollowed from rose-colored stone where water once again dictated survival. Their architecture, like the Olmecs' monuments, sought to make permanence out of concealment. Because if the Olmecs spoke through sculpture and sealed their history beneath the soil, the Nabataeans would carve their greatness straight into the mountain, and their silence would echo through the canyons of the desert. The desert always looks silent from afar, but when you walk through it, the stone itself begins to speak. In southern Jordan, narrow gorges slice through mountains, the color of rose and rust, and at their heart, carved into living rock, stands a facade that could belong to a dream. This is Petra, the city of the Nabataeans, traders, engineers, and sculptors of the void. To understand how such a city could exist in a place that rarely sees rain, you have to start underground. The first and most striking truth about the Nabataeans is their mastery of water in a landscape defined by thirst. Archaeologists tracing the canyons have uncovered miles of hidden canals, terracotta pipelines, and cisterns carved into the sandstone, designed to trap every drop of rain that fell from the cliffs. They built small dams to slow runoff, channels to divert it towards storage basins, and overflow systems that prevented erosion. Every courtyard, every tomb, and every street was part of a hydraulic network that made the impossible livable. It was not luck or miracle, it was engineering so refined that modern hydrologists still study it. In the desert, water was power, and the Nabataeans controlled it as both resource and ritual. If the canals and reservoirs reveal the invisible skeleton of the city, its visible skin shows a second revelation, a language of stone that merges east and west. The facades of Petra are not random ornamentation, they are dialogues, Egyptian cornices, Hellenistic columns, Assyrian reliefs, all reimagined in sandstone. This hybrid style tells the story of a people who sat at the crossroads of empires but belonged to none. In the first centuries BCE and CE, the Nabataeans grew rich from caravan trade, moving incense from Arabia, silk from the east, and spices toward the Mediterranean. Their capital reflected that wealth in rock, a permanence carved from transience. The monumental tombs, with their pediments and urns, are less a display of death than a statement of continuity, that even in the desert, culture could be as fluid as trade routes, and yet leave something eternal. Within this aesthetic synthesis lies another layer of heritage that historians trace through script. The Nabataean alphabet, written on walls and pottery fragments, forms the third thread of this story. From its cursive strokes, modern Arabic would later emerge. The transition from angular Aramaic forms to the flowing letters of early Arabic scripts can be followed line by line through Nabataean inscriptions. It's one of history's quiet metamorphoses, an empire that vanished, yet whose alphabet survived to become the written voice of a civilization that would one day span continents. Through this continuity, the Nabataeans extended their legacy far beyond their sandstone cliffs, turning language itself into a monument more enduring than their temples. But power, built on trade, is always at the mercy of shifting routes. As maritime commerce through the Red Sea expanded under Roman control, the camel caravans that had once enriched Petra lost their primacy. The city's prosperity, anchored in overland networks, began to wane. The Roman annexation of Nabataea in 106 CE marked a political turning point, yet the decline was not immediate. For more than a century after incorporation, Petra remained a regional hub, its artisans carving and its cisterns filling with seasonal rains. The fourth fact in this sequence lies in that coexistence. Rather than being erased by conquest, the Nabataeans adapted, adopting Roman styles, while preserving their own infrastructure. Coins minted under Trajan and later emperors bear both imperial titles and Nabataean symbols, a testimony to negotiation rather than destruction. When Rome eventually shifted the trade routes northward and favoured ports like Berenike, Petra's economy quietly collapsed. The city's stones endured, its caravans did not. Yet even as the economic heart of the Nabataean kingdom slowed, its cultural pulse kept beating through its religion and art. The Nabataeans were not idol builders in the traditional sense. Their gods were abstract, often represented by betyls, rectangular stone blocks, with minimal carving, symbols of divine presence, rather than anthropomorphic forms. In Petra, hundreds of these betyls appear in niches and altars dedicated to Dushara, the chief male deity, and to Al-Uzza, a goddess of fertility and protection. These cults reflect both Arabian roots and Hellenistic reinterpretation, a blend of desert spirituality and Mediterranean formality. That duality, abstraction fused with sensuality, gives Nabataean art its strange serenity. It is as if they found a way to express faith without revealing too much of it. Taken together, these 5 strands form a coherent pattern. First, hydraulic mastery turned desert into city. Second, artistic synthesis made it cosmopolitan. Third, the script connected it to future empires. Fourth, its integration into Rome illustrated resilience rather than ruin. And fifth, its faith distilled transcendence into geometry. The Nabataeans built with water, stone, and silence, 3 elements that outlast sound and war. Even their decline followed that logic: no catastrophic fall, no recorded massacre, just a gradual fading into dust and scripture. When later travellers rediscovered Petra in the 19th century, guided by Bedouin who still knew its hidden paths, they found facades half buried by sand, but remarkably intact. The city had survived precisely because it was carved into the mountain, not built upon it. What time erodes, the rock protects. And as the explorers brushed away centuries of sediment, they realized that Petra was not a ruin in the usual sense. It was a hollow sculpture, a civilization turned inward. Standing before the treasury facade, you can almost hear the echo of its builders. Artisans, chiseling in silence, calculating shadows, so that sunlight would strike the urn at dawn and fade by noon. The same precision that guided their canals, guided their architecture, a rhythm of control and release. In this sense, Petra was never abandoned. It was sealed like a cistern waiting for rain. This logic of concealment and endurance threads through all the lost civilizations you've seen so far. The Nabataeans' decision to shape their identity into cliffs rather than palaces mirrors Göbekli Tepe's buried enclosures, Çatalhöyük's sealed homes, and Laventa's dismantled temples. Each civilization understood, perhaps intuitively, that permanence is not achieved by expansion, but by retreat, by hiding what must survive. When you leave Petra and look back through the narrow gorge that guards its entrance, the light narrows to a golden slit. It's the same light that guided the caravans and, centuries later, explorers and pilgrims. The desert keeps its secrets well. It turns memory into landscape. And yet even in that stillness, you can sense a faint connection running eastward and westward, linking Petra's traders to markets in India and ports in the Mediterranean. That invisible network of exchange leads naturally to the next mystery, a people of mesas and canyons on another continent, who built their cities not into mountains, but atop them. Like the Nabataeans, they watched the sky for guidance, and the water for survival. Their stone villages would cling to cliffs like honeycombs, aligned to the sun and stars, and then inexplicably, they too would vanish. Because if Petra is the art of carving permanence from desert stone, the next civilization perfected the art of reading heaven from earth. And their disappearance, etched into canyon walls, under the blazing light of the American Southwest, will ask again the same question: how does a society so closely attuned to the cosmos simply step away from it? The air changes again when you climb into the high meshes of the American Southwest. Here, light behaves differently. It sharpens edges. It deepens silence. The canyons of Chaco and Mesa Verde hold ruins that are neither buried nor erased, only paused. They seem to be waiting for someone to finish a conversation that ended too suddenly. And that quiet waiting is where the story of the ancestral Puebloans begins, those whom later Navajo traditions would call the Anasazi. Their world was a geometry of sun and stone. The first truth you notice, and the foundation of this section, is their celestial precision. Across the Chaco Canyon complex, built between the 9th and 12th centuries CE, archaeologists have mapped alignments so exact that they still mark solstices and equinoxes with shadows that slide perfectly along carved notches. The sun dagger at Fajada Butte, a spiral carved into rock where beams of sunlight pass only on specific days, is not a coincidence of erosion, but a deliberate instrument. Its creators understood the year's rhythm better than many agrarian kingdoms surrounded by rivers. By synchronizing architecture and sky, they turned every wall into a calendar. This was their science and their prayer, to live in harmony with the heavens by inscribing its path into the landscape. Yet, what gives these alignments meaning is not only astronomy, but community. The second thread of their mystery emerges in the social fabric of migration and kinship, recorded in rock art and oral tradition. Petroglyphs show footprints, spirals, and animals in motion, not random symbols, but maps of movement. Anthropologists have traced the patterns of settlement and abandonment across the Four Corners region, revealing waves of relocation that follow droughts, resources, and spiritual visions. The pueblos were never static fortresses. They were stations in a wider circuit of identity. Each move carried not just possessions, but ancestral memory, the sense that home was not a fixed point, but a relationship with the land. The ancestral Puebloans' mobility was adaptation turned into philosophy, survival through circulation. Within their architecture lies the physical proof of cooperation on a massive scale. The great houses of Chaco Pueblo Bonito, Chetroquetl, and others rise in semicircular tiers of sandstone blocks, some containing hundreds of rooms and ceremonial chambers called kivas. Each block was hand-shaped, each timber carried from distant mountains. This level of organization implies a system of labor coordination, trade routes for materials, and a hierarchy flexible enough to build but not to dominate. There are no palaces, no fortifications, only shared spaces aligned to cosmic markers. The third key element of their world lies in this paradox. They achieved monumental order without central tyranny. Where other civilizations expressed authority in walls, the Puebloans expressed it in rhythm, the repetition of round and square, of plaza and kiva, of light entering through an opening exactly when the sun demanded it. As with so many ancient societies, climate became both sculptor and destroyer. Around the late 13th century, the region suffered what dendrochronologists identify as one of the most severe droughts in 2 millennia. Tree ring data shows decades with minimal rainfall, crops failed, and the delicate equilibrium between ritual and resource began to unravel. This fourth fact, the long drought, is supported by evidence both natural and human: abandonments, fires, the cessation of pottery production, the migration of entire communities southward toward the Rio Grande Valley. For a people whose identity depended on the cycle of water and sun, the loss of rain was not just ecological, it was existential. When the land stopped responding, the dialogue with the heavens broke. Yet drought alone cannot explain the final silence. The fifth element, and perhaps the most haunting, comes from the oral histories of descendant communities, Hopi, Zuni, and others, who speak of ancestors who went into the earth or returned to the sky. These are not metaphors of disappearance, but transformations. Archaeology sees migration, myth sees metamorphosis. Some scholars interpret these legends as reflections of mass relocation and cultural integration into emerging Pueblo groups farther south. Others suggest a symbolic reading that when the covenant with nature was broken, the people withdrew into a sacred cycle beyond sight. Both readings remind you that collapse is often an outsider's word for change. For those within the story, it may have felt like continuation. When you step back and connect the 5 strands: celestial architecture, migratory networks, communal construction, drought, and mythic return, a portrait emerges that is neither tragic nor mystical, but profoundly human. The ancestral Puebloans mastered balance between autonomy and unity, between science and belief, between permanence and movement. Their cities, carved into cliffs and aligned with stars, were not defenses, but mirrors. They mirrored the sky so that the people could see themselves within it. Their disappearance, too, mirrored the rhythm of the world they worshipped: creation, growth, withdrawal, renewal. What looks to us like abandonment may have been, for them, an act of faith to leave when the cycle required it. That quiet dignity lingers in the ruins of Mesa Verde, where ladders still lean against kiva entrances, as if the inhabitants might return after the next rain. The ancestral Puebloans' story closes one arc and opens another. The silence they left behind is not unique to the deserts of North America. On the far side of the world, another civilization vanished beneath the flood of its own river, leaving behind not stories on stone, but eyes of bronze staring into eternity. While the Anasazi watched the heavens from their cliffs, artisans in a Chinese basin were crafting masks with features so exaggerated they seemed to belong to spirits, not humans. Both cultures looked upward, both dissolved without clear cause. And so, as you leave the canyon and its whispering walls, the road turns east again, to the valleys of Sichuan, where archaeologists uncovered a hoard so alien to known Chinese history that it rewrote the timeline. a civilization with no written record, no known kings, and artistry unlike anything before or after. It will challenge even the idea of what China once was. Because if the ancestral Puebloans made the sky their compass, the next lost culture shaped the heavens into faces of metal, the eyes of bronze, that await you do not just watch, they remember. Mist often settles over the Sichuan basin, softening the edges of mountains and fields. For centuries, that mist also covered a chapter of history no one suspected existed. When farmers digging a ditch near Guanghan in 1929 unearthed a pit filled with broken jade and bronze, it seemed a local curiosity. Only decades later did the scale of the discovery become clear. Two immense sacrificial pits filled with relics from a civilization older than classical China, yet utterly distinct from it. The site, now known as Sanxingdui, revealed a world both familiar and alien, a kingdom that mastered bronze as skillfully as the Shang dynasty, but imagined the divine in shapes no one had seen before. The first solid fact of this section rises from the ground itself, the scale and uniqueness of the Sanxingdui bronzes. Masks with huge protruding eyes, statues of men twice human size, trees of life adorned with birds and serpents. Over 13,000 artifacts have been excavated, dating from around 1200 BCE. Their craftsmanship rivals that of any Bronze Age culture, yet their style breaks completely from the symmetrical realism of the Shang. The proportions are impossible, ears like wings, eyes like telescopes, expressions halfway between trance and vigilance. Metallurgical analysis shows advanced techniques of casting and alloying. These were not primitive experiments, but deliberate aesthetic statements. Whoever cast them was inventing a visual language where power and cosmos merged into one. The second revelation lies in the suddenness of their burial. The pits were not random dumps. They were carefully arranged deposits, each containing smashed bronzes, burnt ivory, jade, and gold. Radiocarbon dating and stratigraphy confirmed that the objects were deliberately broken and buried in a single ritual act. Archaeologists interpret this as a large-scale ceremonial closure, a collective decision to end a chapter of the city's life. There is no evidence of invasion or natural disaster, no layer of destruction consistent with war. Instead, Sanxingdui seems to have dismantled itself, perhaps during a shift of power, a new dynasty, or a spiritual reformation. The act recalls Göbekli Tepe's burial thousands of years earlier, a deliberate concealment of sacred memory. The people who covered their masterpieces were not conquered, they were concluding something. What makes the mystery deeper is the third strand, the absence of writing. Despite the complexity of their art and metallurgy, no inscriptions have been found in the Sanxingdui assemblages. The civilization remains nameless in its own voice. Chinese historical texts, written centuries later, mention a kingdom called Shu, located in the same region, known for wealth and isolation. Many scholars believe Sanxingdui was the political and ritual center of early Shu. The link, however, is indirect, an inference drawn from geography and chronology. Without texts, Sanxingdui speaks only through form. Its silence forces interpretation through comparison, with the Shang to the east, with later Shu artifacts from Jinsha, another site discovered nearby in 2001, and with myths that may echo its memory. Those myths compose the fourth fact, the narrative echo that outlasted the city. Ancient chronicles, such as the Chronicles of Huayang, tell of a ruler named Kangkong, described as having protruding eyes and divine insight. Another legend recalls a king who could commune with the heavens through bronze mirrors. When the Sanxingdui masks with their bulging eyes were first displayed, these tales suddenly felt less metaphorical. The continuity between mythic description and archaeological reality is not proof, but resonance. It suggests that memory, even distorted by centuries, preserved the image of a people who imagined seeing farther than others. The mask, with its outstretched gaze, became an instrument of that vision, a conduit between human and divine. The myth of Kangkong, once dismissed as fantasy, now feels like a fragment of history refracted through legend. The fifth and final dimension of Sanxingdui's enigma comes from its disappearance and re-emergence at Jinsha, about 40 kilometers away. After the ritual burial of Sanxingdui around 1100 BCE, the cultural focus of Shu seems to have shifted to this new site. At Jinsha, archaeologists found similar motifs: gold masks, ivory, bronze figures, but in smaller scale and different style. The shift implies either a migration or a transformation rather than extinction. Environmental studies suggest that an earthquake may have diverted the Minjiang River, cutting off Sanxingdui's irrigation and forcing relocation. Thus, natural change and ritual closure might have converged. The people did not vanish, they adapted, carrying their gods with them in new forms. The civilization's end was therefore not annihilation but evolution, a passage from grandeur to continuity. When you weave these 5 strands, monumental art, ritual burial, absence of writing, mythic memory, and environmental transformation, the picture that emerges is not a blank, but a mirror. Sanxingdui stands as evidence that human creativity can bloom in complete isolation and still reach cosmic heights. Its bronzes look alien because they were never meant to imitate humans. They were attempts to portray perception itself, eyes enlarged to hold the sky, hands extended to balance worlds. It is as though the artists of Shu sought to sculpt consciousness. The site's rediscovery in the late 20th century also reshaped Chinese archaeology itself. Before Sanxingdui, early Chinese civilization was thought to have radiated outward from the Yellow River Plain, spreading culture like concentric waves. Sanxingdui shattered that model. It proved that complexity had multiple origins, that civilization was not a single river, but a delta of creativity. The Middle Kingdom had always been plural. Each new artifact from the pits, the towering bronze tree, the gold masks, extended that pluralism, suggesting parallel innovations rather than imitation. The ancient Shu were not peripheral, they were central to their own world. To stand before one of the masks today is to feel watched. The gaze of those bronze eyes crosses 30 centuries without blinking. They are not portraits of rulers or gods in the conventional sense. They are visions of seeing itself, reminders that perception was once a sacred act. The silence of their world persists because no written words survive to frame it. And yet that silence speaks eloquently. It says that knowledge can take the form of metal and myth, that understanding can be transmitted through beauty alone. What connects Sanxingdui to the other lost civilizations is that same gesture of deliberate closure. Like Çatalhöyük's buried homes and Petra's hidden city, Sanxingdui's people chose to end a chapter by concealing their own creations. This repetition across ages and continents suggests an intuition shared by all early cultures that eternity is safest underground. What we call loss might have been their definition of preservation. From here, the trail of vanished kingdoms curves westward once more, toward lands that knew the sea as battlefield and mirror. Long before Greece or Rome built their legends, an island in the Aegean wove its own, of artisans who carved marble idols, of sailors who vanished into storms, of a culture whose purity was drowned by time. But before returning to that sea, another horizon calls, the green terraces of South America, where mountains touch clouds and stone meets precision beyond reason. Because if Sanxingdui reminds you that vision can be cast in bronze, the next lost world will show that vision can be carved into mountains, a civilization that measured the cosmos not with telescopic eyes, but with stones so perfectly fitted that even earthquakes could not separate them. The kingdom of the Andes awaits, its walls still whispering equations of the stars. The Andes rise like the bones of the earth, bare and eternal. From the Pacific coast to the spine of South America, the mountains draw lines of stone that defy distance and time. High among them lie ruins that seem impossible, walls fitted without mortar, terraces that cling to cliffs like green skin, and paths that trace the horizon with mathematical precision. It is here, in this vertical world, that the enigma of the Andean civilizations begins, centuries before the Incas unified them. The first reality to face is older than Machu Picchu or Cusco, the civilization of Tiwanaku near Lake Titicaca, flourishing between 400 and 1000 CE. Its architecture provides the first cornerstone of this section, the art of stonework that challenges logic. The Gateway of the Sun, carved from a single block of andesite weighing more than 10 tons, contains reliefs of winged figures and celestial symbols that align with solar events. At the site's core, the Kalasaya Temple and the Akapana Pyramid demonstrate not only technical mastery but cosmic intention. The stones fit so perfectly that even modern tools struggle to reproduce their joints. Archaeologists debate how such precision was achieved with the technology of the era, bronze chisels, ropes, and human effort. Yet the alignment of these monuments with solstices and the lunar calendar suggests that Tiwanaku's builders were not only engineers but astronomers. Their architecture was a dialogue between stone and sky, a tangible calendar built into the landscape. From this foundation of stone arises the second element, the mystery of water. Tiwanaku's success depended on a unique agricultural system adapted to high altitude, raised fields called sucacolis. These platforms, surrounded by canals, moderated temperature and preserved moisture, creating microclimates that protected crops from frost. Modern agronomists who have replicated the technique found that it increases yield dramatically, even under Andean extremes. The rediscovery of these systems proves that ancient science, grounded in observation and ecology, rivaled the achievements of any empire. When Tiwanaku eventually declined, the knowledge of these water networks faded, only to be relearned a millennium later. Thus, water again becomes a silent protagonist, the same element that sustained Petra and Chaco, now elevated to ritual status in the thin air of the Andes. If the first two facts reveal mastery over nature, the third introduces mystery over meaning, the absence of a written script. Like the people of Sanxingdui or the Olmecs, the Tiwanakans left no decipherable records. Their messages survive through iconography, carvings of staffs, condors, and sun discs, and through the spread of their style across the Andes. The staff god, a central figure holding twin rods, appears from Tiwanaku to distant valleys in Peru and Chile, suggesting a shared religious system rather than an empire of conquest. Scholars interpret this icon as a synthesis of duality, life and death, sky and earth, a cosmology where the divine is balance itself. Without written words, the Tiwanakans spoke through repetition and geometry. Their art functioned as theology carved in relief. The fourth thread connects Tiwanaku's rise and fall to the rhythm of climate. Sediment cores from Lake Titicaca show a long wet period, followed by a severe drought around 1000 CE. As water levels fell, the canals that fed the raised fields dried, the crops failed, and the city that had been built around agricultural abundance lost its anchor. Archaeological layers reveal abandonment, not conquest. People dispersed toward smaller settlements, carrying fragments of their culture, motifs, rituals, architecture into new valleys. The collapse was ecological, not military. Yet what distinguishes Tiwanaku's end is the absence of panic in its ruins. The temples were not destroyed, only emptied. Like Sanxingdui, like Çatalhöyük, it seems the inhabitants understood the necessity of departure. The silence of the Andes, perhaps, was their final act of devotion. And then, centuries later, came those who inherited both the geography and the genius of their predecessors, the Inca. Here lies the fifth and most famous chapter, the perfection of Andean stonecraft and the mystery of Machu Picchu. Built in the 15th century under Pachacuti, the citadel embodies a philosophy refined over millennia, the union of architecture, astronomy, and landscape. Every structure follows the terrain rather than imposing upon it. The Intihuatana stone, the hitching post of the sun, marks solstices with exactitude. Its angles catch light like a clock without hands. The city's orientation along ridgelines ensures both defense and alignment with sacred peaks, or apis, considered living deities. Despite its fame, the function of Machu Picchu remains uncertain. Royal retreat, ceremonial center, or astronomical observatory. What is undeniable is its precision. Each block fits with another as if fused by intent rather than mortar. In seismic terms, the design anticipates earthquakes. In spiritual terms, it mirrors the heavens. When the Spanish arrived, they never found Machu Picchu. Its isolation spared it from destruction. Yet the empire that built it collapsed within decades, undone by disease, civil war, and conquest. The Incas, like Tiwanaku before them, had woven their world around cycles of harmony, agriculture tied to astronomy, society tied to reciprocity. The arrival of foreign gods broke that balance. In less than a century, the largest empire in pre-Columbian America became legend. The irony is that its most enduring monument, Machu Picchu, was not its capital, but its hidden sanctuary. Secrecy, once again, became salvation. When you consider the arc from Tiwanaku to Cusco, the pattern becomes clear. Innovation in response to landscape, harmony with extremes, disappearance without destruction. The Andes, more than any other geography, demanded cooperation with the impossible. To live there was to engineer altitude itself. That feat required not just tools, but worldview, a sense that humans were caretakers of cosmic equilibrium. Modern science continues to trace how deeply the Andean worldview integrated observation with faith. Quipu, knotted cords used for record-keeping, represent a unique form of non-verbal writing, a tactile mathematics that preserved census data, tributes, and genealogies. Recent computational analyses suggest that some quipu may encode linguistic elements, not only numbers. If confirmed, the Incas and their predecessors may have been literate in a way our alphabets can barely imagine, through texture rather than ink. Taken together, the Andean civilizations embody the paradox that threads through all the lost worlds before them, technological mastery intertwined with voluntary silence. Their stonework defies erosion, yet their voices dissolved in wind. Their calendars still align with the stars, yet their stories must be inferred from fragments. In every sense, they built not monuments, but equations, each wall a proof of coexistence between geometry and gravity, faith and function. Standing before the remnants of Tiwanaku, or the terraces of Machu Picchu, you feel that same quiet perfection. The stones breathe with the temperature of the earth. They expand, contract, and settle as if alive. It's hard to call them ruins. They are not broken, only paused. From the heights of the Andes, the line of civilizations bends north again, across oceans and centuries, to another land of terraces and temples, where stone and star also converged. There, in jungles swallowed by time, a different people recorded their history with a precision unmatched anywhere on Earth, only for that history to fall silent, too. Their glyphs remain carved into walls, their calendars surpass even ours, and yet their cities were overtaken by vines and myths. Because if the Andes perfected the architecture of harmony, the Maya mastered the architecture of time, and when their clocks stopped, the jungle closed its green hand around one of humanity's most intricate experiments in order and oblivion. Humidity thickens the air long before the jungle opens its grip. When you reach the limestone plains of the Yucatan and the dense forests of Guatemala, sound itself seems slower, muffled by vines, absorbed by the ruins beneath. Out of this endless green rise temples that look more like mountains than buildings, stairways climbing to where the sky begins. The Maya did not merely live in the jungle, they designed time within it. Their civilization, born more than 2,000 years ago, remains one of the most intricate expressions of human intellect, and one of the most hauntingly incomplete. The first truth, the foundation of this chapter, lies in their calendar. Every inscription, every monument, every ritual converged toward the measurement of time. The Maya combined three systems: the Tzolk'in, a 260-day sacred cycle, the Hab, a 365-day solar year, and the Long Count, a continuous chronology that stretched across millennia. The coordination of these cycles was not just mathematics, but theology, a cosmology of recurrence. At Copan, Palenque, and Tikal, stelae record dates corresponding precisely to astronomical events, eclipses, solstices, and planetary alignments. Modern astronomy confirms the accuracy of these calculations within seconds. Time, for the Maya, was alive. It breathed through architecture, ceremony, and sky. That synthesis between mathematics and cosmos naturally shaped their writing. The second strand of this story, the Maya script, composed of more than 800 glyphs, combined phonetic signs and logograms, allowing for poetry, politics, and prophecy alike. For centuries, no one could read it. Conquistadors, encountering it on stone and bark, mistook it for pagan ornament and destroyed most codices. Only 4 authentic books survive: the Dresden, Madrid, Paris, and Grolier codices. They contain tables of Venus, eclipse predictions, rituals of renewal, proof of a scientific mind that saw no boundary between the empirical and the sacred. The modern decipherment, achieved through the work of Tatiana Proskuryakov, Yuri Knorosov, and others, transformed what was once decorative mystery into historical voice. Now the Maya speak again, recounting wars, dynasties, alliances, and ceremonies in their own words. What looked timeless was, in fact, history all along. From the language carved on their monuments emerges the third revelation, the scope of their urban world. At its height, between 250 and 900 CE, the Maya realm extended across what is now southern Mexico, Guatemala, Belize, and parts of Honduras and El Salvador. It was not an empire, but a constellation. Dozens of city-states linked by trade, diplomacy, and ritual warfare. Each center, Tikal, Calakmul, Palenque, Caracol, had its own ruler, its own lineage, its own emblem glyph. Yet their architecture followed shared cosmic logic. Pyramids aligned to cardinal directions, ball courts mirrored the underworld, and observatories measured the sun's zenithal passage. Laser mapping in recent years has revealed that beneath the forest lie not isolated ruins, but entire networks of roads, reservoirs, and terraces capable of supporting millions. The Maya were not scattered mystics. They were urban engineers of staggering ambition. Still in all this precision lies the fourth and enduring mystery, their sudden transformation between the 9th and 10th centuries CE. Across the southern lowlands, monumental construction ceased, inscriptions stopped, and populations declined. Tikal, Copan, and many others were abandoned. The classic collapse, as scholars call it, was not one event, but a convergence. Paleoclimatic data from lake sediments and cave stalagmites reveal repeated mega-droughts lasting decades. Deforestation and soil depletion compounded the stress. Rivalry among city-states, once ceremonial, turned destructive as resources dwindled. Famine, migration, and social upheaval followed. The last dated monument of the southern Maya reads 909 CE, a silence carved into stone. Yet even here the story is not one of annihilation, but adaptation. Northern centers, such as Chichen Itza and later Maya Pan, rose as others fell, blending Toltec influences into a new synthesis. The Maya world did not end, it reconfigured. The fifth element of the puzzle reaches beyond archaeology into continuity. Today, more than 7 million Maya descendants live across Mesoamerica, speaking over 30 related languages and preserving rituals tied to their ancestral calendars. They are living evidence that collapse was never extinction. The long count itself never predicted an apocalypse for 2012, as popular imagination suggested. It marked the completion of a cycle, a renewal, not an ending. What perished in the jungle was not a people, but a political order. The mind that counted Venus and carved eternity into limestone still beats in living tongues. When you assemble these 5 threads, the calendar, the script, the urban network, the drought-driven transformation, and the survival of the people, a single pattern unfolds. a civilization that thought in cycles, not lines. For them, history was not progress toward a goal, but repetition toward balance. Their art and architecture are acts of synchronization between heaven and earth, light and darkness, life and death. Even their decline follows that logic. The rain stops, the stars shift, and the world must begin again. To walk through Tikal is to step into that pulse. The temples rise like stone metronomes, measuring the intervals of forgotten centuries. When the wind passes through the plazas, it carries both absence and memory. The jungle is not reclaiming the city, it is completing it, folding it back into the pattern of rebirth the Maya themselves believed in. The deciphered inscriptions have changed how we see them, no longer as enigmatic astronomers lost to mystery, but as human storytellers wrestling with the same questions of power, faith, and survival that shaped every other civilization. Their kings made mistakes, their alliances crumbled, their priests recalibrated calendars when the heavens failed to align. The grandeur of their monuments hides very human hopes. And still, among those glyphs and stars, one question remains constant. How did a culture so mathematically exact, so spiritually attuned, allow itself to dissolve? The answer may be simpler and more profound than disaster. They obeyed their own design. When a cycle ends, the wise step aside for the next to begin. The Maya may have enacted the same cosmic pattern they recorded for ages: creation, decline, renewal. As dusk spreads over the jungle and the howler monkeys begin their low chorus, the temples catch the last light like embers of an ancient equation. Somewhere beyond the horizon lies another world that also vanished into foliage and legend. One built not of limestone, but of red brick, one that rose beside rivers and left behind cities arranged by cardinal points as well. Across an ocean and 2 millennia, the symmetry continues. Because if the Maya measured eternity in cycles of sun and shadow, the next civilization measured it in the rhythm of monsoons. A people who built canals instead of pyramids, who left no armies carved in stone, but a script still unreadable, and whose disappearance haunts the rainforests of Southeast Asia. Their name, whispered through the ruins of Angkor, means city, yet what they created was a cosmos. In the heart of Cambodia, the jungle thickens into a labyrinth of roots and towers, where the line between forest and stone dissolves. It is a place where rain becomes architecture, where trees seem to grow from temples rather than over them. The Khmer Empire's capital, Angkor, remains one of humanity's greatest experiments in scale, faith, and fragility. Here, the ruins do not whisper of a single event of destruction, but of slow retreat. An empire that once commanded half of Southeast Asia reduced, over centuries, to silence under the weight of its own magnificence. The first truth that anchors this chapter is one of audacity. Angkor was the largest pre-industrial city in the world, covering nearly 400 square kilometers at its height between the 9th and 15th centuries CE. Its population may have exceeded 1 million, sustained not by conquest but by water. The Khmer perfected a hydraulic civilization, a vast system of canals, reservoirs, barrages, and embankments that turned the capricious rhythm of the monsoon into a reliable engine of agriculture. The east and west barrages, each several kilometers long, served as both reservoirs and symbolic oceans surrounding the cosmic mountain of the capital. Recent LiDAR mapping reveals the precision of this network, channels intersecting like veins, controlling the flood and drought cycles of the Tonle Sap Basin. It was a city designed not merely to inhabit the jungle, but to orchestrate it. The second layer of Angkor's identity lies in its architecture and cosmology, inseparable from one another. Temples like Angkor Wat, Bayon, and Ta Prohm were not built as houses of worship alone, but as diagrams of the universe. The Khmer conceived their capital as a mandala, a map of creation rendered in stone. Angkor Wat's central tower represents Mount Meru, the axis of the cosmos, while its concentric galleries symbolize the oceans and continents surrounding it. The precision of its alignment, exactly oriented to the west, toward the setting sun was not accidental but theological, reflecting Vishnu's role as preserver and the cyclical nature of life and death. Every measurement encoded meaning. The perimeter of its outer wall matches the length of the solar year in cubits. The vertical divisions correspond to lunar cycles. Here, mathematics and devotion merged seamlessly. Around this cosmic core thrived a society of astonishing organization. The third fact that defines the Khmer legacy is their infrastructure of labor and administration. Inscriptions carved into temple walls describe corvée systems, thousands of workers assigned to maintain reservoirs, carve bas-reliefs, transport sandstone blocks from quarries 50 kilometers away. Each temple complex functioned as both religious and economic hub, surrounded by rice fields and villages that sustained its priests, artisans, and soldiers. The bas-reliefs themselves record the empire's reach, processions of elephants, naval battles, celestial dances, and everyday life. This abundance of visual documentation provides a rare window into the rhythm of an empire that balanced agrarian order with divine kingship. Yet beneath this grandeur was a delicate equilibrium. The fourth strand of Angkor's story, the beginning of its decline, emerges from the same system that sustained it. The hydraulic network required constant maintenance. Sedimentation, shifting monsoons, and ecological stress gradually undermined its balance. Studies of tree rings and lake sediments show that the 14th and 15th centuries brought alternating decades of severe drought and torrential floods. The canals cracked in the heat, then overflowed in storms. As the climate fluctuated, harvests failed, and the city's lifeblood, rice and water, faltered. At the same time, political fragmentation and external pressure grew. Ayutthaya, the rising Siamese kingdom to the west, challenged Khmer supremacy. By 1431, when Ayutthayan forces briefly sacked Angkor, the city's decline was already irreversible. The invaders merely accelerated a process long in motion. The fifth and most enigmatic dimension of Angkor's fate lies in its transformation, not destruction. After the fall, the Khmer capital shifted south to Phnom Penh, but Angkor itself was never truly abandoned. Buddhist monks continued to inhabit and maintain certain temples, converting Hindu sanctuaries into Theravada shrines. Angkor Wat, unlike the deserted ruins of the Maya or Tiwanaku, remained a living temple throughout the centuries. European explorers rediscovered it in the 19th century, but for locals, it had never disappeared. Its persistence defies the narrative of total loss. The empire vanished, the sacred geometry endured. When you gather these 5 threads, hydraulic mastery, cosmic architecture, social organization, climatic vulnerability, and spiritual continuity, the pattern of Angkor becomes clear. The Khmer did not simply build a city, they constructed a mirror of the universe, sustained by the pulse of the monsoon. Their achievement was as much philosophical as technical, to live within cycles rather than against them. The same pattern that allowed them to flourish also dictated their decline. Water, their greatest ally, became their undoing when balance slipped. Standing before Angkor Wat at dawn, as the temple's reflection ripples across the moat, you feel how the Khmer measured eternity in light. The sun rises directly above the central tower, twice a year, its rays cutting through the corridors like a blade of gold. The temple's bas-reliefs, stretching nearly a kilometer, depict the churning of the ocean of milk, gods and demons, pulling a serpent to create the elixir of immortality. The image is both myth and metaphor, creation through tension, stability through struggle. It encapsulates the Khmer worldview that harmony must be constantly renewed through motion. Modern technology has only deepened the wonder. LiDAR scans show that Angkor was part of a complex urban network stretching far beyond what was visible: suburbs, roads, irrigation lines. It was not a city surrounded by jungle, it was a landscape civilization where nature itself was part of the design. Yet its vastness proved fragile against climatic shifts, mirroring the vulnerability of modern megacities facing environmental change today. The fall of Angkor is not an ancient cautionary tale, it is a mirror held to the present. Even in its ruin, Angkor's influence endures across centuries. Its architectural logic migrated through Southeast Asia, inspiring temple mountains from Laos to Thailand. Its aesthetic vocabulary, the lotus towers, the celestial dances, the balance of vertical and horizontal, became shorthand for sacred geometry. But the most powerful inheritance is invisible, the idea that architecture can embody cosmology, that the human hand can shape the earth in imitation of heaven. When you leave Angkor and walk into the encroaching jungle, roots twist around stone as if reclaiming what was always theirs. Yet the carvings of apsaras, divine dancers, remain untouched, smiling through centuries of moss. Their gestures seem to echo a truth shared by every vanished civilization. Endurance lies not in permanence, but in rhythm. From the flooded plains of Cambodia, the trail of lost worlds turns west once more, across deserts and centuries, toward another civilization that also measured its empire in stone and silence, one that spanned half a continent, worshipped its rulers as gods, and left behind colossal heads that rival even those of the Olmecs. Its collapse, too, remains an open question, written in the geometry of its avenues and the shadows of its pyramids. Because if Angkor was a city built upon water and light, Teotihuacan was a city built upon air and fire, a place where humans aligned themselves not to monsoons, but to the movements of the sun itself, and where the gods of creation and destruction shared the same horizon. The Valley of Mexico stretches wide and still, its volcanic rims framing a basin once filled with shimmering lakes. In that ancient mirror of water and sky, a city rose, whose name we still struggle to translate, Teotihuacan, the place where gods were born. Long before the Aztecs found it in ruins and gave it that title, it had already lived through its full arc of creation, glory, and silence. What remains today, the Avenue of the Dead, the pyramids of the sun and moon, the temple of the feathered serpent, stands not as the relic of a single dynasty, but as the fossil of an entire worldview, built on alignment, ritual, and power, rendered in stone. The first truth about Teotihuacan, confirmed by the excavation of its foundations, is its deliberate geometry. The city was planned on a grid of astonishing precision, its main axis tilted 15.5 degrees east of true north, aligned to the setting of the Pleiades and to the sun's zenith passages. This orientation dictated the position of every major temple, plaza, and residential compound. Recent satellite and LiDAR studies show that even outlying neighborhoods followed this cosmic blueprint. Teotihuacan was not an organic settlement that grew by chance. It was an architectural manifesto. The Pyramid of the Sun, with its 2.5 million cubic meters of stone, and the Pyramid of the Moon, mirroring the silhouette of the Cerro Gordo mountain behind it, together transformed landscape into cosmology. Each staircase was a calendar, each plaza a theatre of celestial order. From that order emerged a second revelation, the scale of its society. At its height, between 100 and 550 CE, Teotihuacan held perhaps 100,000 inhabitants, making it one of the largest cities in the world. Excavations reveal apartment compounds built of stone and plaster, decorated with murals of jaguars, serpents, and priests, evidence of social organization, craft specialization, and artistic sophistication. Unlike later empires ruled by named kings, Teotihuacan's governance remains anonymous. No royal tombs or clear portraits of rulers have been found. Power here seems collective or theocratic, exercised through institutions rather than individuals. Murals depict processions of priests, warriors, and deities, but none proclaim a single monarch. The city's identity, like its name, belongs to everyone and no one. That anonymity is its strangest triumph, a metropolis without a face, yet with unmistakable will. If its structure was mathematical, its religion was elemental. The third thread of Teotihuacan's mystery lies in its pantheon and its sacrifices. Beneath a temple of the feathered serpent, excavations uncovered more than 200 human remains, warriors, captives, and possibly priests, buried with obsidian blades, jewelry, and animal offerings. The precision of the placement suggests a ritual of cosmic renewal rather than wanton cruelty. The feathered serpent itself, later known as Quetzalcoatl, dominates the temple facade with alternating serpent and jaguar heads, symbols of water and fire, fertility and destruction. Through such dualities, Teotihuacan's faith expressed the same cosmic balance seen in its architecture. Even death was part of equilibrium. And yet, that equilibrium would not hold forever. Around the mid-6th century, something fractured. The fourth fact, the mystery of Teotihuacan's collapse, remains one of archaeology's most contested puzzles. Layers of ash in the city's elite compounds reveal widespread burning, but not of the Great Pyramids themselves. The destruction seems selective, as if directed against symbols of authority. Some scholars interpret this as evidence of internal revolt, a social uprising against priestly or ruling classes. Others point to external pressures, droughts triggered by volcanic eruptions, trade disruptions, or conflict with neighboring cultures. Paleoclimate data indicates a period of aridity that could have strained food supplies and destabilized the social order. The truth may be a synthesis, environmental stress igniting internal unrest. Whatever the cause, by the 7th century, the city's population had dwindled, its avenues abandoned, its gods left to the wind. The fifth dimension of Teotihuacan's enigma comes not from its fall, but from its rebirth in memory. When the Mexica, whom we now call the Aztecs, arrived in the valley nearly a millennium later, they found the ruins already ancient. They believed the pyramids were the birthplace of the sun and moon, the stage upon which gods sacrificed themselves to light the world. They gave the city its current name and integrated it into their mythology as the origin of cosmic order. In their rituals, they returned to Teotihuacan as pilgrims, not archaeologists. To them, it was not a ruin, but a revelation, a living landscape of divinity. That act of reinterpretation ensured that Teotihuacan would never truly vanish. Its silence became sacred. When you step onto the Avenue of the Dead today, the geometry still commands you. The space between the pyramids was designed not for traffic, but for processions, a corridor of ceremony that drew the city's inhabitants into collective rhythm. You can almost feel that pulse return at sunset, when the last light slides along the stones and the mountains mirror the pyramid's silhouettes. The precision still works, the calendar still keeps time. What unites Teotihuacan with all the other lost civilizations is this refusal to fade completely. Its architecture continues to function, its alignments still trace the heavens. The people may have gone, but the design endures. Perhaps that is what they intended, to build a world so attuned to the cosmos that it could keep breathing after humanity's voice fell silent. From a modern perspective, Teotihuacan also warns of complexity's paradox. The same systems that elevate a society make it fragile. Centralized order, ecological management, and ideological unity can transform into rigidity when the environment shifts or belief falters. When balance collapses, grandeur becomes burden. The city that once mirrored the cosmos ultimately mirrored its impermanence. And yet Teotihuacan's afterlife continued to shape Mesoamerica long after its streets were empty. Its iconography spread to the Maya, Zapotecs, and later the Toltecs. Its urban planning influenced Tenochtitlan itself. Even the Aztec emperors who claimed descent from the gods of Teotihuacan measured their legitimacy by proximity to its ruins. The city's silence became a political instrument, proof that divine order once dwelled among men. To stand atop the Pyramid of the Sun is to confront the raw idea of civilization, stripped of detail, geometry, horizon, light. The wind erases speech, but amplifies awe. From this height, the valley below looks like an immense clock, the ghosts of avenues still marking hours no one keeps. As twilight descends, the volcanoes in the distance, Popocatépetl and Iztaccíhuatl, glow like sleeping deities. The light lingers over the pyramids, turning their edges to bronze. In that moment, it's easy to imagine the city alive again. Fires in courtyards, drums along the avenue, priests raising obsidian mirrors to catch the last reflection of the dying sun. Beyond this basin, the line of lost worlds moves south once more, to another highland, where obsidian also shone, and kings carved their faces in jade. There, in the valleys of Honduras and the plains of El Salvador, another empire would rise, smaller in scale but equal in sophistication, before being erased by fire and conquest. Because if Teotihuacan was the geometry of gods, the next kingdom was the geometry of prophecy, a civilization that foresaw its own destruction and recorded it in glyphs before the swords ever arrived. The kingdom of the Aztecs, born in the shadow of Teotihuacan, would be both heir and sacrifice to the same gods who once demanded order through blood. The Valley of Mexico has a way of repeating itself. Civilizations rise upon the bones of others, inheriting their gods, their calendars, and their obsessions with balance. By the time the Mexica arrived there in the 14th century, Teotihuacan had already been a myth for nearly 1,000 years. They did not see themselves as founders, but as heirs, the chosen people tasked with restoring cosmic order where others had failed. Their capital, Tenochtitlan, grew from prophecy, an eagle perched on a cactus, devouring a serpent. To those who saw it gleaming in the middle of the lake, it must have looked like a dream of symmetry and devotion. To those who conquered it, it seemed like the heart of a universe that had dared to build perfection on water. The first truth of the Aztec world lies in its foundation, not metaphorical but literal. Tenochtitlan was built on an island in Lake Texcoco, connected to the mainland by causeways and traversed by canals. The Mexica turned the watery basin into a living machine of agriculture through chinampas, floating gardens formed from woven reeds and mud, anchored by trees. These artificial islands, cultivated year-round, could yield several harvests annually, sustaining a population that may have reached 200,000. European chroniclers marveled at their efficiency, vegetables, flowers, and maize glistening under morning mist, a mosaic of productivity that made the city self-sufficient. Like the Khmer with their reservoirs, the Mexica mastered their environment through rhythm rather than conquest, turning water from obstacle to resource. From that rhythm emerged the second fact, the Aztec cosmos, a structure of relentless symmetry. The universe was a web of dualities, life and death, creation and destruction, sun and shadow. The myth of the 5 suns taught that the world had been created and destroyed 4 times before, each cycle ending in catastrophe. Jaguars, wind, fire, and flood. The current age, the 5th sun, demanded perpetual nourishment through human blood to sustain the cosmic balance. This belief did not make the Aztecs cruel, it made them terrified of stillness. Every sacrifice was an act of maintenance, every temple a machine to keep the sky turning. The rituals of Templo Mayor, with its twin sanctuaries, to Huitzilopochtli and Tlaloc, war and rain, embodied this duality. When the priests lifted hearts to the sun, they were not indulging in brutality, but performing cosmic accounting, paying a debt that could never be fully settled. The third layer of their mystery unfolds in their art and writing, a language both visual and mathematical. The Aztec codices, painted on deer hide or maguey paper, are not linear texts, but maps of time and duty. They record genealogies, tributes, and prophecies in vivid pictograms, using color and proportion to convey meaning. Their architecture followed the same logic, modular repetition, symmetry across cardinal directions, and geometry aligned to astronomical events. In the Templo Mayor excavations, archaeologists found serpentine sculptures representing the layers of the cosmos, with offerings of jade, coral, and seashells, the ocean invoked at the heart of the mountains. Every symbol connected earth to heaven and back again. Their political structure mirrored their cosmology, expansion as obligation. The 4th strand of their story reveals how empire and religion became indistinguishable. Through conquest, the Aztecs sought not merely territory but tribute to feed the gods. By the early 16th century, Tenochtitlan had become the axis of a tribute network spanning hundreds of cities. Markets such as Tlatelolco bustled with cacao, obsidian, feathers, gold, and slaves. Tribute lists inscribed on stone record staggering quantities of goods delivered to the capital, yet such perfection was brittle. The system demanded constant warfare to replenish its offerings, and subject peoples chafed under its weight. When the Spaniards arrived, they found not a unified empire, but a network strained by fear and exhaustion, a structure magnificent but unstable. The fifth element, the end, unfolds with tragic precision. In 1519, Hernan Cortés marched into the valley, drawn by rumors of gold and gods. The encounter between two cosmologies, Christian and Mexica, was less battle than collision. Moctezuma II, the emperor-priest, received Cortés with gifts and caution, uncertain whether he faced a man or a returning deity. Within 2 years, disease, betrayal, and superior weaponry reduced the city to ashes. The causeways that had once connected Tenochtitlan to the world became escape routes under siege. The Spaniards drained the lake that had sustained the city, erasing its reflective brilliance forever. Yet, even amid ruin, the Aztec mind refused to vanish. Chroniclers like Berendino de Sahagún and native scribes of the Florentine Codex preserved fragments of their worldview, songs, myths, and prayers whispered between lines of translation. One poem, attributed to the poet-king Nezahualcóyotl, survives as a quiet rebellion against oblivion. Not forever on earth, only a little while here. Even jade is shattered, even gold is crushed, even Quetzal feathers tear apart. Not forever on earth, only a little while here. If you connect the 5 threads, environmental genius, cosmic duality, symbolic language, imperial expansion, and spiritual endurance, you see the complete pattern of the Aztec cosmos, a civilization that knew impermanence and still chose to build as if eternity were possible. Their temples, even in fragments, align precisely to solstices. Their calendars match Venus cycles to fractions of days. Everything was designed to hold the universe together, even for one more dawn. When you stand today at the excavated remains of Templo Mayor, surrounded by the noise of modern Mexico City, the sense of continuity is overwhelming. Beneath glass floors lie offerings of serpents and shells. Above, towers and traffic pulse in rhythms the Aztecs would have recognized, motion as survival. The lake is gone, but its memory persists in the humidity, in the rain that still falls over the valley, as if obeying the old gods. The Aztecs did not vanish, they were absorbed. Their blood, language, and symbols survived in syncretic forms. Catholic saints, wearing indigenous colors, processions timed to ancient festivals, Nahuatl words embedded in everyday Spanish. Their cosmos found ways to persist, disguised but undefeated. And beyond them, across the sea, another civilization once built its power upon similar faith in divine kingship and mathematical order. Its temples rose not on lakes, but on islands of the Mediterranean, and its destruction came not from conquest, but from the sea itself. There, myths of a vanished kingdom would inspire philosophers and explorers for millennia, blending truth and imagination until history and legend became indistinguishable. Because if the Aztecs believed that the world ended and began in cycles, the next lost civilization turned that idea into eternal question. A kingdom said to have fallen beneath the waves, yet whose echo refuses to drown. The story of Atlantis awaits, where archaeology ends and myth begins to remember. The sea has always been humanity's oldest mirror. Every civilization that looked into it saw not just reflection, but prophecy, a reminder that what it gives, it eventually takes back. Somewhere within that mirror, between the known and the imagined, the idea of Atlantis was born. Long before explorers charted oceans, Plato spoke of an island of unmatched power and virtue, destroyed in a single day and night by the anger of the gods. For more than 2 millennia, scholars, dreamers, and divers have searched for it, not realizing perhaps that the real mystery is not whether it existed, but why it endures. The first reality to acknowledge is that Atlantis began not as legend, but as philosophy. In his dialogues, Timaeus and Critias, written around 360 BCE, Plato used the story of a great island empire beyond the Pillars of Hercules to illustrate moral decline, a society corrupted by pride, punished by nature. The account was framed as history attributed to the Egyptian priests, who supposedly told the tale to Solon, the Athenian lawgiver, but its purpose was allegorical, a mirror to Athens itself, warning against hubris. Plato describes a city of concentric rings, canals and palaces, a civilization that mastered the seas yet lost its soul. Whether invented or inspired by older memories, his description fixed Atlantis in human imagination as both paradise and cautionary tale. The second layer of truth lies in geological and cultural echoes that make the myth plausible. Around 1600 BCE, long before Plato, the island of Thera, today's Santorini, erupted with catastrophic force, sending ash across the Aegean and collapsing part of the island into the sea. Archaeologists excavating Akrotiri have uncovered a Minoan city frozen in volcanic ash, multi-storey houses, frescoes of dolphins and lilies, plumbing, and advanced urban planning. The eruption would have caused tsunamis and atmospheric changes that destabilized the Minoan world, centered on Crete. For many scholars, this disaster and its aftermath could be the memory behind Atlantis. The similarities are striking: an island civilization of seafarers suddenly destroyed by water and fire. Plato's day and night of misfortune may echo a collective memory of that eruption, preserved through centuries of oral retelling. Yet Thera is not the only candidate. The third strand of Atlantis's enigma stretches across continents and ages. In the Atlantic, hypotheses have pointed to the Azores, the Caribbean, even Antarctica. Off the coast of Spain, submerged ruins near Cadiz and Doñana National Park have fueled speculation of Tartessos, a wealthy Bronze Age culture mentioned by ancient sources as a possible origin. Underwater surveys have revealed geometric anomalies, but none definitive. In the Sahara, satellite imagery exposes remnants of circular landforms known as the Eye of the Sahara, or the Richat structure, whose shape uncannily resembles Plato's concentric rings. Each theory, however, confuses geology with myth. The persistence of so many candidates suggests that Atlantis is not a single place, but a pattern, a human instinct to locate perfection and loss at the ocean's edge. The fourth dimension of the mystery lies in its influence rather than its archaeology. During the Renaissance, the rediscovery of Plato's dialogues coincided with Europe's maritime expansion. Explorers interpreted Atlantis as premonition, proof that vast lands awaited beyond the horizon. In the 17th and 18th centuries, thinkers like Francis Bacon and later Ignatius Donnelly transformed the myth into proto-history, claiming Atlantis as the mother of all civilizations. Donnelly's 1882 book Atlantis, The Antediluvian World, argued that the pyramids, the Maya, and even Norse myths descended from this lost continent. Though his ideas lacked evidence, they shaped modern pseudo-archaeology and inspired generations of seekers. Atlantis evolved from moral allegory to blueprint of yearning, the idea that somewhere, once, humanity achieved perfection and then fell. Yet even within fiction, fragments of truth often persist. The fifth thread emerges from the deep ocean itself, from real events that remind us how thin the boundary between land and sea can be. Geological studies confirm that global sea levels have risen more than 120 meters since the last ice age, submerging vast coastal plains that once held human settlements. Around the world, divers have found megalithic structures and stone alignments beneath waves: Yonaguni off Japan, the Gulf of Cambay in India, and Doggerland beneath the North Sea. None match Plato's Atlantis, but all testify that civilizations can indeed vanish beneath the ocean without leaving written memory. In that sense, Atlantis is true, not as location, but as inevitability, a name we give to the countless lost coasts of prehistory. When you connect these 5 currents, Plato's philosophy, Thera's eruption, the global search, the myth's reinvention, and the geological evidence of real submerged worlds, Atlantis transforms from legend into symbol. It represents both the fragility of civilization and the resilience of myth. Its power lies in the tension between evidence and imagination. Every age projects its own anxieties onto it. For Plato, moral decay; for explorers, discovery; for modern science, catastrophe. The island is reborn whenever humans fear they have gone too far. Standing at the edge of Santorini's caldera, you can almost reconstruct the scene. The sea drawn back, the roar of the eruption, the collapse of a culture that once sailed between islands, adorned with frescoes of peace. The disaster would have seemed divine, a punishment written in fire. Centuries later, the survivors' descendants may have told stories of an island swallowed whole, a narrative that, once transcribed by a philosopher, became immortal. The persistence of Atlantis also reveals a deeper truth about memory. Civilizations need their ghosts. They define themselves not only by what they build, but by what they believe they have lost. Atlantis is the eternal lost homeland, the unreachable origin that gives meaning to all that came after. Every empire has its own version. For the Egyptians, Zep Tepi; for the Maya, the mythic Tulan; for the Celts, Avalon. Each serves the same purpose, to remind that greatness always precedes us and destruction always waits. Modern oceanography has mapped nearly every continental shelf, yet the idea refuses to die, not because of ignorance, but because the myth serves a psychological function no map can replace. In a world where everything is measured, Atlantis remains immeasurable, a reminder that the unknown must exist for meaning to endure. The legend's endurance across time, religion, and science proves that humanity's greatest lost civilization may be our own capacity for wonder. As night falls over the Aegean, the sea turns to glass, reflecting the stars with unnerving clarity. For a moment you understand why Plato chose water as both origin and punishment. The ocean hides nothing, it only transforms visibility into depth. Somewhere beneath those waves lies not a city of gold, but a universal memory, that the higher we build, the more fragile the foundation becomes. And beyond this sea, where waves meet sand, and memory turns to myth, lies another lost world, one even older, buried not beneath water, but beneath time itself. Long before Plato wrote of islands and floods, a continent across the Indian Ocean was said to have vanished, leaving only scattered peaks behind. Lemuria, like Atlantis, is a name whispered between science and speculation. Yet, unlike Atlantis, its origins trace not to philosophy, but to biology, a story of vanished bridges and mistaken maps that turned scientific error into spiritual geography. Because if Atlantis was the West's dream of a sunken utopia, Lemuria was the East's reflection, a land that never existed, that somehow feels remembered by the earth itself. The Indian Ocean is not quiet. Beneath its surface, tectonic plates drift and collide, rewriting coastlines and erasing continents 1 inch at a time. Somewhere within its depths, between Madagascar, India, and the islands of the East, lies the ghost of a land that never was. Lemuria, unlike Atlantis, which began as moral allegory, Lemuria was born from science, a hypothesis turned myth, a mistake that became a memory. Yet even errors have power. When they answer questions the heart still asks. The first truth behind this phantom continent began in the 19th century, not in myth but in biology. European naturalists studying lemurs, small primates found in Madagascar and southern India, but nowhere in between, wondered how such animals could have crossed the vast ocean. Alfred Russel Wallace, Charles Darwin's contemporary, rejected supernatural explanations, but struggled with geography. In 1864, the zoologist Philip Sclater proposed a solution, a now sunken landmass connecting Madagascar and India, which he named Lemuria. It was a scientific hypothesis meant to explain biogeography long before the discovery of plate tectonics. Though later disproven, the idea captured the imagination of scholars and occultists alike, merging empirical curiosity with the romance of lost worlds. The second layer of the story unfolded as science advanced. Geologists soon recognized that continents moved, that land bridges were unnecessary to explain species distribution. Lemuria should have vanished into footnotes, but by then it had escaped into myth. Helena Blavatsky's The Secret Doctrine, 1888, transformed Lemuria from biological theory into spiritual origin, claiming it as the home of a third root race, beings neither fully physical nor fully divine, precursors to modern humanity. Her theosophical vision fused evolution with mysticism, presenting Lemuria as humanity's forgotten Eden. The continent became less about lemurs and more about loss, the longing for an age when spirit and matter were one. Yet myths, even modern ones, often find echoes in older stories. The third strand, connecting Lemuria to ancient memory, appears in South and Southeast Asian traditions. Tamil literature from southern India speaks of Kumari Kandam, a vast land swallowed by the sea, home to an advanced Dravidian civilization. Early Tamil scholars of the 19th century, reading colonial interpretations of Lemuria, identified it with their own legend. To them, Kumari Kandam was not fiction, but ancestral truth, the cradle of Tamil language and culture before it was drowned. Across the ocean in Indonesia, Malayo-Polynesian myths recall lands sinking beneath waves, while in Australia, Aboriginal Dreamtime stories tell of coastlines once far wider, now lost to the sea. These are not coincidences, but cultural memories of rising sea levels after the last ice age, encoded in myth long before science measured them. Lemuria, in this sense, became a vessel for many voices, a shared remembrance of the world's reshaping. The fourth dimension of Lemuria's endurance lies in the discovery of something partially real beneath its mythic skin. In 2013, geologists analyzing zircon crystals from the sands of Mauritius, an island formed by volcanic eruptions, found minerals billions of years older than the island itself. These remnants matched the composition of continental crust rather than oceanic basalt, suggesting fragments of an ancient microcontinent submerged between Madagascar and India. They named it Mauritia. It was not Lemuria, nor a cradle of lost civilizations, but it proved that sunken land masses do exist. The earth, restless and fluid, constantly builds and buries its own geography. What myth imagined, geology confirmed in principle. Continents can disappear. Still, the real power of Lemuria lies in the fifth thread, its transformation into a metaphor of connection. In the 20th century, the idea of Lemuria found new life in literature, esotericism, and even political identity. Tamil nationalists embraced Kumari Kandam as proof of their culture's antiquity, while Western mystics placed Lemuria's ruins in the Pacific, linking it to Easter Island or Hawaii. In each retelling, the lost land served as mirror. Europeans projected utopia, colonized peoples projected memory, scientists projected curiosity. Lemuria became the shared space where myth and identity met, not a continent under the sea, but a continent of imagination. When you connect these five currents, scientific hypothesis, mystical adaptation, cultural fusion, geological resonance, and symbolic rebirth, Lemuria ceases to be error and becomes revelation. It reveals how humans respond to gaps in understanding by filling them with stories that feel truer than data. Its endurance shows that myth is not the opposite of science, but its shadow, the language we use when evidence runs out, but meaning still demands form. Standing on the black beaches of Madagascar, watching the horizon blur into mist, it's easy to see why such myths take root. The sea hides everything with the same indifference. Fossils, temples, memories. Somewhere out there, fragments of Mauritia rest beneath kilometers of water, silent proof that the earth erases as skillfully as it creates. The idea that an entire world might sleep beneath the waves feels less impossible than incomplete. Lemuria's persistence across cultures also mirrors a deeper psychological truth, the longing for origins that no archaeology can deliver. Every civilization seeks a birthplace older than memory, a place where everything began in harmony before fragmentation and exile. Lemuria provided that mythic homeland for the East just as Atlantis did for the West. Together they form twin hemispheres of nostalgia, balancing reason with reverence. In modern times, oceanography has mapped the sea floor and disproved Lemuria's literal existence, yet the name endures in science fiction, music, and philosophy. It represents not delusion, but continuity, the instinct to see pattern in chaos, to imagine roots even when history dissolves them. The ocean between Madagascar and India remains one of Earth's least explored regions. There are no temples there, no ruins visible to sonar, but in the imagination, Lemuria rises each time humanity wonders where it truly began. When you trace the lineage of lost civilizations, Lemuria stands apart. Göbekli Tepe, Sanxingdui, and Tiwanaku left stones and bronzes to study. Lemuria left only reflection, and yet it binds them all through its lesson. That civilization itself is temporary geography, a brief emergence before submersion. The waves that erased Lemuria also shape the coasts of every continent today. They whisper the same refrain that runs through this entire journey, that nothing we build lasts forever, and that perhaps permanence was never the goal. Beyond the Indian Ocean, the trail of vanished worlds continues south and east, toward archipelagos where myth and memory intertwine again. Islands dotted with statues staring at the horizon, faces turned toward a sea that once gave life and later abandoned it. There, far from continents, another civilization sculpted silence into stone, watching centuries of isolation turn into eternity. Because if Lemuria was the dream of a lost continent, Rapa Nui, Easter Island, is the proof of what happens when a civilization builds its gods too large for the land that sustains them. The Pacific is an ocean of distances, so vast they dissolve meaning, yet scattered across it are small islands that have carried entire civilizations, microcosms of triumph and collapse, written in coral and stone. Of all of them, Rapa Nui, Easter Island, remains the most haunting. Its mystery does not lie in the fact that it is lost, but in how something so small produced monuments so enormous. To stand among the moai, the great statues that watch the horizon, is to confront a civilization that turned isolation into art and art into warning. The first reality that defines Rapa Nui is its impossibility. The island lies more than 2,000 kilometers from the nearest inhabited land, a volcanic triangle barely 160 square kilometers wide. Yet by the 13th century, Polynesian navigators, masters of reading stars, swells and bird flight, found it and made it home. Archaeological evidence suggests the settlers arrived with chickens, yams and tools, establishing a thriving society adapted to volcanic soil. They built stone villages, agricultural terraces, and an intricate religion centered on ancestral worship. Every moai, carved from tough stone at the quarry of Rano Raraku, represented a deified ancestor whose presence ensured fertility and stability. The statues were not idols of gods, but conduits of lineage, the past literally watching over the living. The second truth rises from the sheer scale of their ambition. More than 900 moai were carved, some over 10 meters tall, and weighing up to 80 tons, transporting them across rugged terrain to their coastal platforms. The ahu required extraordinary organization. The prevailing theory now, supported by experimental archaeology, shows that the statues were walked upright, using ropes and coordinated teams, rocking them forward like living beings. This technological choreography demonstrates both ingenuity and cohesion, a society that could move mountains through rhythm and cooperation. The act itself was spiritual, Each journey from quarry to shore reanimated the ancestor, transforming raw stone into presence. But ambition, as always, carries cost. The third layer of Rapa Nui's story is ecological, the slow undoing of its own miracle. Palynological studies reveal that the island was once covered in dense palm forests, now gone. Deforestation began as trees were felled for agriculture, fuel, and the transport of moai. Without trees, soil eroded and crops declined. The population, once perhaps 10,000, faced scarcity. By the 17th century, traditional systems strained under pressure. Oral traditions speak of conflict, the Huri Moai. When rival clans toppled statues of enemies, the Moai, once protectors, became victims of crisis. Archaeology confirms widespread statue toppling, though not necessarily war on the scale myth suggests. Still, the symbolism is unmistakable. Faith turned against itself. The fourth fact concerns contact, both tragic and transformative. In 1722, the Dutch explorer Jacob Roggeveen arrived on Easter Sunday, giving the island its western name. Later visits by Spaniards and British followed, bringing disease, violence, and disruption. The most devastating came in the 19th century, when Peruvian slavers raided the island, capturing hundreds, including priests and artisans, and leaving a population decimated by smallpox and collapse of cultural continuity. Christian missionaries arrived soon after, converting survivors and dismantling the old religion. By 1877, only 111 Rapa Nui people remained. The Moai, toppled and eroded, stood as silent witnesses to both internal and external catastrophe. The narrative of ecocide, popularized in the late 20th century, portrayed the Rapa Nui as victims of their own excess, a cautionary tale of environmental collapse. But newer research complicates that view. Evidence suggests they adapted ingeniously to changing conditions through rock gardens that conserved moisture and nutrients, and that much of the devastation resulted not from self-destruction, but from colonization. The myth of collective suicide was in part projection, the West seeing its own fears reflected in a small island's fate. Yet even in ruin, the island's legacy endured. The fifth and final thread is the resilience of its people and their ongoing dialogue with the statues. In the late 20th century, descendants of the original Rapa Nui began cultural revival efforts, restoring language, ceremonies, and some moai themselves. Archaeologists working with local communities re-erected statues using traditional techniques, reconnecting practice with heritage. The moai once again faced the sea, guardians not of crops but of memory. Today, Rapa Nui is both archaeological site and living homeland, where ancient cosmology coexists with modern survival. The people who were once mythologized as vanished remain very much alive, their history now told in their own voice. When you connect these five strands, discovery and navigation, monumental creation, ecological transformation, colonial impact, and cultural renewal, the story of Rapa Nui becomes less about mystery than about continuity under extreme isolation. It is the story of humanity compressed to an island, replaying on a small scale the grand cycle of ambition and adaptation that defines every civilization on Earth. To walk the island is to move through time itself. The moai face inward, not toward the sea, but toward the villages they protect. Their backs to the horizon suggest a philosophy of guardianship, not conquest. The Ahu platforms align with celestial events. Some point toward solstices, others toward ancestral stars guiding navigation. The same ocean that once brought settlers now isolates their descendants, but it also preserves the purity of their cosmology, a world where lineage, land and sky form one continuum. At night, when wind sweeps across the slopes of Rano Raraku, the moai appear almost animate under starlight. The Milky Way arcs overhead like a carved path of its own. Polynesian voyagers once read those stars as maps, tracing invisible highways across the Pacific. The same constellations still hang above the statues, connecting Rapa Nui to the wider Polynesian world, Hawaii, Tahiti, Aotearoa, all fragments of a single cultural ocean. Their navigation techniques, passed orally for millennia, are now being revived by modern sailors, using no instruments, only memory and sky. The ocean, once barrier, is again bridge. Rapa Nui's endurance, then, is not tragedy, but lesson. It teaches that isolation magnifies every human choice: creativity, faith, destruction, resilience. It shows that even the smallest society can reach grandeur without armies or writing, through sheer coherence of belief. And it warns that balance with the environment is not static but dynamic, a conversation that must never stop. As the dawn rises behind the Moai, the statues cast long shadows over the grass, their silhouettes merging with those of visitors who come from around the world. In that moment, the distance between past and present collapses. You realize that the mystery was never how they built the statues, but how they endured long enough to build them at all. Beyond the horizon of Rapa Nui, the ocean stretches unbroken until it meets the coasts of South America, a continent whose oldest civilization predates the Inca, built pyramids older than Egypt's, and then disappeared with almost no trace. There, at the edge of Peru's desert, a lost city named Caral sleeps under the sand, its story whispering that greatness may begin not with war or empire, but with music and peace. Because if Rapa Nui teaches that isolation can magnify the human spirit, Caral will remind you that civilization itself can be born from harmony and still vanish in silence. In the coastal desert of Peru, where wind sculpts dunes and the Pacific's mist drifts inland, lie the remains of a civilization so old it rewrites the timeline of the Americas. Long before the Inca, long before even the Maya built their pyramids, the people of Caral were already raising monumental cities, playing flutes of bone, and mapping the stars above the desert sky. They left no weapons, no fortresses, no written records, only terraces, amphitheatres, and the hum of ancient harmony still caught in the wind. The first truth that defines Caral is its age. Radiocarbon dating places its beginnings around 2600 BCE, making it as old as Egypt's first pyramids and centuries older than the cities of the Indus Valley. Its discovery at the end of the 20th century transformed understanding of the Americas. Archaeologist Ruth Shady's work at Supita Valley revealed a civilization sprawling across more than 30 settlements, all connected by trade and ritual rather than conquest. The city of Caral itself was its crown, 6 pyramids rising from the desert, circular plazas designed for public ceremony, and complex irrigation systems that coaxed life from the arid soil. Here civilization emerged not from warfare but from cooperation, a model of order achieved through equilibrium, not domination. From this foundation comes the second revelation, the architecture as cosmology. The Great Pyramid of Caral dominates the site, built in stepped terraces of stone and earth, its summit once supporting temples for fire rituals. Circular amphitheatres beside the pyramids align with astronomical events, particularly the solstices. Excavations show evidence of controlled burns, musical instruments, and offerings of shells and seeds. These elements reveal a society where architecture served both as calendar and ceremony, a physical manifestation of cosmic balance. The absence of fortifications or weapons further reinforces this pattern. Caral was designed to communicate with the heavens, not to defend against men. The third layer of Caral's enigma lies in its economy and connectivity. Far from being isolated, the Caral Supi culture engaged in extensive trade across regions. Excavations uncovered cotton, fish, obsidian, and even spondylus shells from Ecuador, proof of long-distance exchange networks. Cotton, in particular, was central. It provided fibre for fishing nets that fueled coastal abundance. This trade synergy between inland farmers and coastal fishermen formed the backbone of their prosperity. Unlike later empires driven by tribute and conquest, Caral's economy thrived on reciprocity. It was a civilization of equilibrium, a literal weaving of ecosystems. But beneath this harmony, the earth itself carried warnings. The fourth strand of their story is written in tremors. Geological studies of the Supai Valley show repeated evidence of seismic activity and El Niño floods. Some pyramids were rebuilt over older ones, each reconstruction burying the previous phase, a silent record of resilience in the face of disaster. Archaeologists have found ceremonial offerings buried beneath collapsed walls, miniature temples, burnt seeds, and woven cords, acts of renewal after destruction. These gestures suggest that the Caral people perceived natural catastrophe not as punishment but as cycle, part of the cosmic order they sought to balance. Their architecture evolved as dialogue with the Earth's volatility, adapting rather than resisting. The fifth fact ties Caral to the broader narrative of humanity's beginnings, the power of music and ritual as social glue. Among the city's ruins, researchers found 37 flutes made of condor and pelican bones. Their tones still playable, sound, not conquest, held their world together. These instruments likely accompanied ceremonies in the amphitheatres, creating vibrations that echoed against stone terraces and desert winds. The flute's presence in sacred spaces suggests that Caral's cohesion was sensory as much as spiritual. Civilization here was not imposed but orchestrated. When you weave these 5 strands, age, architecture, trade, resilience, and music, the pattern that emerges is astonishingly modern. Caral shows that hierarchy and peace are not mutually exclusive, that art, environment, and community can coexist without domination. It suggests that the first cities did not necessarily rise from conflict, but from collaboration, the desire to gather, celebrate, and find meaning in rhythm. And yet, like all who came before and after, they too vanished. By around 1800 BCE, the Caral Supai culture declined. Climatic shifts likely reduced water flow in the rivers, undermining agriculture. Trade routes shifted, and with them the energy of connection. No invader came, no empire fell, people simply moved elsewhere, carrying fragments of their knowledge into new valleys and generations. The pyramids, stripped of maintenance, slowly surrendered to the desert. Silence replaced the sound of flutes, and the wind became the final musician. Caral's rediscovery, thousands of years later, altered not just history, but perspective. It reminded scholars that complexity does not require violence, that the human urge to organize can be guided by harmony as easily as by conquest. Its pyramids stand not as tombs, but as monuments to cooperation, structures that elevated communities instead of rulers. Even now, archaeologists working under the same desert sun speak of the site with reverence, as though it still hums faintly beneath the dust. Standing before the Great Pyramid at dusk, the desert seems almost transparent. The Andes rise faintly to the east, and the Pacific glimmers beyond the horizon. Between them stretches the Supai Valley, cradle of a civilization that built without destroying. As the light fades, the wind carries the faint sound of air passing through ancient flutes, displayed in museums far away, an echo of voices that never meant to conquer, only to be remembered. Caral's legacy ripples outward through the logic of this entire archive of lost worlds. It proves that civilization's essence, creativity, ritual, adaptation, is universal and fragile. Its survival depends not on domination, but on balance, a lesson echoed across millennia. The people of Caral understood what later powers forgot, that the earth does not yield to control, it collaborates with those who listen. From the desert silence, the journey turns once more toward another threshold of disappearance, this time in Europe's shadow, where a city of bronze and myth once ruled the sea and vanished almost without trace. In its harbours, Phoenician traders exchanged languages and gods. In its depths now lie the last echoes of a people whose name still hums through Mediterranean salt, Tartessos. Because if Caral was the harmony of beginnings, Tartessos will be the harmony of memory, a civilization that bridged myth and empire, then sank beneath the tide of history, leaving behind gold, silence, and rumour. At the edge of southern Spain, where the Atlantic meets the Mediterranean, the light changes quality. It sharpens, as though memory itself has been bleached by centuries of salt and wind. Here, in the marshes and estuaries near the Guadalquivir River, legends say there once stood a city of gold and copper, a maritime power that traded with the known world before Greece had even spoken its myths. Its name drifts between languages: Tartessos, Tarshish, the lost kingdom of the West. For centuries, scholars debated whether it was myth, colony, or something in between. The sand has given up only fragments, yet each one glows with the residue of a civilization that bridged story and substance. The first truth about Tartessos comes from its position. Between the Atlantic and the Mediterranean, it was the natural gate of exchange between Europe and Africa, a meeting point for early Phoenician traders and Iberian peoples. Ancient writers, Herodotus, Strabo, and Avienus, described it as a land rich in metals and rivers that ran silver and gold. Archaeological findings confirm this abundance. Mines in the Sierra Morena yielded copper, tin, and silver, essential for Bronze Age trade. The city, likely near today's Huelva or Doñana, thrived on metallurgy and navigation, linking Atlantic ores to Mediterranean markets. Its geography alone made it destiny, a civilization born of tides and trade winds. The second layer of its story is cultural fusion. Phoenician settlers from the Levant established colonies along the Iberian coast in the 9th century BCE, bringing alphabetic writing, art, and religion. Instead of erasing local traditions, they mingled with them, creating a hybrid identity, Tartessian. Artifacts from sites like El Caramballo reveal gold hoards of astonishing craftsmanship, necklaces, diadems, and plaques, blending Near Eastern motifs with Iberian style. Inscriptions found in southwestern Spain display an undeciphered script that may represent the oldest written language of Western Europe. The synthesis of Phoenician technique and Iberian imagination created something distinct, neither colony nor native, the first truly cosmopolitan culture of the West. The third revelation lies in its relationship to myth. Biblical texts refer to Tarshish as a land of great ships and distant wealth, the source of Solomon's silver and ivory. Greek legends spoke of a far western kingdom ruled by Geryon, whose cattle Heracles was fated to steal, echoes of a prosperous people beyond the Pillars of Hercules. To the ancient Mediterranean mind, Tarshish was the edge of the world, the border between civilization and the Atlantic's unknowable vastness. These myths were not fabrications, but reflections of encounter. When sailors returned with tales of shining metals and vast rivers, poets turned geography into wonder. Thus, Tartessos became both real and symbolic, a liminal realm where history first learned to dream. The fourth thread of Tartessos' enigma is its disappearance. By the 5th century BCE, written references cease. The great city vanishes from record as if swallowed by its own river. Archaeologists suspect a combination of factors: shifts in trade routes, Carthaginian expansion, and environmental change. Sediment studies show that the Guadalquivir estuary silted over during this period, cutting access to the sea and choking commerce. Once maritime channels dried, the city's heart stopped beating, yet no definitive destruction layer has been found, no evidence of fire or invasion. The silence feels deliberate, as though Tartessos receded rather than fell. Like Sanxingdui or Caral, it may have chosen transformation over ruin. The fifth and final fact is the rediscovery of its traces, faint, elusive, but persistent. Excavations in Doñana National Park have revealed rectangular anomalies consistent with ancient foundations beneath the marsh, along with ceramics and Phoenician-style artifacts. Nearby, in the necropolis of La Jolla, tombs filled with gold and ivory testify to wealth and connection. Scholars still debate whether these findings mark Tartessos itself or its cultural descendants, yet every fragment confirms its influence. The so-called Lady of El Caramballo, a gold-adorned idol, stands as emblem of that twilight kingdom, a figure half human, half divine, radiant with the memory of a civilization that never stopped shimmering, even under sand. When you weave these threads, geography, fusion, myth, disappearance, and rediscovery, the portrait of Tartessos emerges not as a lost city, but as a threshold. It was the point where the ancient world first looked west and imagined continuity beyond its own horizon. It joined the cycle that runs through every civilization in this archive: rise, brilliance, retreat, and the quiet survival of memory. Its legacy is written in the DNA of Europe itself, in metallurgy, language, and the persistent human instinct to mythologize origins. Standing on the marshes near Huelva at low tide, you can almost sense the outline of vanished docks beneath the water. The air smells of salt and copper, the same blend that must have scented the workshops of Tartessian smiths. The landscape shifts with each gust, as if rearranging itself to hide or reveal fragments of the past. The sea still whispers at the edge, patient, waiting for recognition. Somewhere beneath these sediments, a harbour sleeps, a mirror to all the lost cities before it. If the journey began with stone circles buried in Anatolia, and ends here in Spain's soft mud, the arc closes upon itself. Each civilization, from Göbekli Tepe to Tartessos, shared an understanding unspoken yet universal, that creation is temporary, that permanence is a rhythm, not a state. The world forgets, and in forgetting, preserves. The silence that follows every fall becomes the next generation's first question. Across 22 chapters, the trail of humanity's vanished worlds reveals one unbroken theme. We build not to last forever, but to be rediscovered. Every pyramid, every tablet, every sunken port is a message sent forward through ruin, a reminder that nothing is ever truly lost as long as someone listens. As twilight deepens over the Atlantic, the waves roll against the shore with the same cadence that once carried Tartessian ships. The horizon glows with the faint memory of fire, and the air seems filled with voices older than empire. They murmur of builders and dreamers, of flutes and temples, of masks and scripts, of gods who demanded nothing more than to be remembered. You have followed those voices across deserts, jungles, and oceans. You have seen how each civilization left behind a fragment of the same question: what does it mean to endure? And now, at the world's western edge, that question dissolves into the sea, not answered, but echoed. Because in the end, every lost civilization was not destroyed. It became the landscape, the myth, the silence that teaches their ruins are not remains. They are instructions to build, to remember, and when the time comes, to let go.